The ancient world holds stories and secrets that are as fascinating as they are strange. Tonight we'll wander through a part of history that most people never think about, the story of toilets. Far from just a daily necessity, they shaped how people lived, how cities grew, and even how empires survived. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in, make yourself comfortable. If you enjoy these quiet late-night explorations, consider subscribing. And if you'd like, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see this little community connecting across different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, let the steady hum of your room surround you, and let's step back into history. Imagine a bustling ancient city, narrow streets filled with traders, the smell of bread baking, and voices shouting out prices for grain and fruit. Now imagine what happens when thousands of people are packed into those same streets, without a good way to get rid of human waste. Quickly, the story of civilization changes from one of prosperity to one of sickness. Toilets were never just private conveniences, they were instruments of survival. A good toilet system meant cleaner streets, fewer deadly plagues, and longer lives. Without them, whole neighborhoods could become breeding grounds for disease. The very idea of urban life, crowds living close together, would have been impossible without some solution to this very basic problem. In early farming villages, people often used pits dug into the ground. These weren't glamorous, but they were practical. Covering waste with soil kept animals away and reduced the terrible smell. It also kept insects from spreading germs. What seemed simple to us was, for them, a life-saving step toward healthier communities. As cities grew larger, the importance of organized waste disposal became even greater. The first true toilets show us just how creative early builders could be. In places like ancient Mesopotamia, clay pipes carried waste away from homes, sometimes even directing it into rivers or fields. These early systems weren't perfect, but they showed that people were thinking beyond the individual. They were building for the community. Toilets also reveal hidden truths about class and status. In many cultures, the rich had private places to relieve themselves, while the poor often used shared spaces. The difference between a wealthy household with a well-drained latrine and a crowded tenement with no facilities at all could mean the difference between life and death. In this way, toilets weren't only about comfort, they quietly mirrored the divisions within society. Even the design of toilets tells us about human ingenuity. A stone seat with a simple hole in it may not sound like a marvel of engineering, but in its own way, it was. Builders had to think about ventilation, drainage, and access. They had to imagine how waste would move, where it would settle, and how it might be removed. Each toilet, whether carved into stone or lined with clay, was a small experiment in keeping chaos at bay. But perhaps the most striking lesson is how toilets shaped history itself. Take public health, for example. Epidemics often swept through crowded towns, carried by water contaminated with waste. Civilizations that invested in drainage and toilets, even rudimentary ones, often fared better than those that ignored the problem. Rome's aqueducts are remembered for carrying clean water, but their sewers, carrying waste away, were just as vital. And yet, for all their importance, toilets were rarely celebrated. Writers filled scrolls with tales of gods and kings, battles and conquests, but almost no one wrote poems about the humble latrine. Still, these hidden corners of daily life carried civilizations forward. They were the unseen foundations of survival. When we trace the history of toilets, we are really tracing the history of how humans learned to live together. From pits in the ground to elaborate public baths, each step was an answer to the same question. How do we share space without destroying ourselves? That question was as vital thousands of years ago as it is today. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of toilets not as something mundane or unworthy of history, but as one of humanity's quiet triumphs. They turned chaos into order, filth into safety and transformed settlements into lasting civilizations. When we think of ancient Mesopotamia, most of us imagine temples rising out of the desert, clay tablets pressed with cuneiform writing, and the steady flow of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. What we rarely picture are the quieter details of daily life, where people ate, how they cleaned, and of course, where they went to relieve themselves. Yet in the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, archaeologists have found evidence of toilets that were surprisingly advanced for their time. In some households of ancient Ur and Babylon, toilets were constructed with vertical shafts made of baked clay or brick. These shafts carried waste downward, sometimes several feet below the home, where it collected in pits. Servants or night workers would then clean out the refuse when the pit grew too full. It was not glamorous work, but it was essential. The fact that wealthy households invested in these shafts tells us that privacy and cleanliness were already valued thousands of years ago. These early Mesopotamian toilets also reveal something about engineering. Building a shaft that did not collapse, leak, or allow foul smells to fill the home required planning. Bricks had to be carefully laid, the opening had to be stable, and the base had to be wide enough to contain waste. It was, in its own way, a quiet architectural achievement, one hidden beneath floors and behind walls. In public spaces, however, things looked quite different. Not everyone had the luxury of a private shaft or latrine. The poorer citizens of Mesopotamia often relied on open areas or shallow pits dug outside their homes. This meant that waste sometimes seeped into water supplies, especially after heavy rains. The division between private, well-built toilets and improvised outdoor ones is a reminder that sanitation was always tied to wealth and privilege. But Mesopotamia wasn't the only early culture to think seriously about toilets. At roughly the same time, far to the east, the Indus Valley civilization was developing an urban sanitation system that still amazes historians today. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, which thrived around 2500 BCE, were among the first in the world to be planned on a grid. Their streets ran in straight lines, their buildings were laid out with care, and underneath it all ran one of the most impressive sewer networks of the ancient world. Many houses in the Indus Valley had their own latrines. These were often simple brick structures with a hole at the top and a sloping chute that directed waste into covered drains. The drains themselves were made of baked brick, fitted tightly together and covered with removable slabs of stone. Workers could lift the slabs to clean the channels, keeping waste from piling up. It is astonishing to think that over 4,000 years ago, people were already living with toilets that connected to sewer lines, a system that would not be matched in many parts of the world for centuries afterward. While other civilizations relied on open pits or primitive shafts, the Indus Valley people built something that feels startlingly modern. The presence of these drains also tells us something about the values of the society. Cleanliness seems to have been considered a shared responsibility. These were not simply private conveniences for the wealthy. Entire neighborhoods were linked together by sewer channels, showing that the health of the community was seen as important. The Indus Valley's approach was cooperative. Waste was not just a private matter, but a public one. Even bathing was tied to this system. Many homes contained bathing areas with drains that connected to the same sewers as the toilets. In Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists uncovered what appears to be a massive public bath, suggesting that washing and sanitation were part of civic life, not just private routines. The connection between hygiene, ritual, and daily survival seems to have been deeply ingrained. It is important to pause and recognize how rare this was in the ancient world. While Mesopotamia and Egypt were building monumental temples, the Indus Valley was investing in drains, baths, and latrines. The ruins tell us that sanitation was woven into the very design of their cities. This emphasis may explain, at least in part, why their settlements could grow so large without collapsing under the weight of disease. Of course, not everything about these toilets was perfect. Night soil, human waste collected from toilets, still had to be removed and transported. Workers likely carried it outside the city or used it as fertilizer in fields. The job was dirty and unpleasant, but it was also necessary for the system to function. Sanitation has always required labor, and in every age, someone has had to shoulder that burden. What is striking, though, is the silence in the written record. The Indus Valley people left behind thousands of seals and artifacts, but their script remains undeciphered. We have no surviving descriptions of how they viewed toilets, no poems or stories about sanitation. All we have are the bricks, the drains, and the carefully laid channels. From these alone, we can sense that cleanliness was part of their everyday world, even if they never wrote it down. If Mesopotamian toilets reflect the divide between rich and poor, the Indus Valley toilets reflect a sense of collective responsibility. Where one emphasized private shafts and household privilege, the other emphasized public drains and shared maintenance. Two very different solutions shaped by two very different cultures, but both reminding us that sanitation was never just a technical matter. It was social, political, and cultural. The story of these early toilets also hints at something larger, the way civilizations think about the unseen. Monuments, temples, and palaces are meant to be admired, but drains and sewers are hidden away. They are built not for beauty, but for necessity. And yet they are what make cities livable. A civilization without toilets is like a body without a circulatory system. The surface may look fine, but underneath sickness waits to spread. As we close our eyes and imagine the quiet alleys of Mohenjo-Daro or the courtyards of Babylon, we should remember the hidden channels below. There, beneath the stones, the lifeblood of the city flowed. Waste was carried away, health was protected, and daily life went on. Civilization is often remembered through its grand achievements, but sometimes the most telling details are buried just beneath our feet. So the next time you hear of Mesopotamia's kings or the mysteries of the Indus seals, think also of the workers lifting stone slabs, the drains running beneath the streets, and the brick latrines tucked away in homes. These were the quiet foundations of life, the unseen guardians of health. They remind us that the story of toilets is not simply about waste. It is about how humanity learned to live together, side by side, in cities that pulsed with life. When we picture ancient Egypt, we usually imagine towering pyramids, the golden mask of Tutankhamun, or the solemn statues of pharaohs lined along temple avenues. The desert sun, the Nile's steady flood, and the silent grandeur of tombs dominate our imagination. But beneath that glittering image of kings and gods, the Egyptians also faced ordinary, unavoidable needs. Among them was the quiet matter of where to relieve oneself. Egyptian toilets, though less celebrated than pyramids, tell us a great deal about daily life. In many homes uncovered by archaeologists, especially those in workmen's villages such as Deir el-Medina, simple toilets were built into the walls. These were usually stone or wooden seats, carefully cut, with an oval opening at the center. Beneath the seat sat a ceramic jar or vessel. This vessel caught the waste, and it could be removed, emptied, and replaced when full. Compared to the sewer systems of the Indus Valley, these setups were modest. They did not connect to underground drains, nor did they transport waste away from the home. Instead, sanitation depended on manual labor. Servants or family members would carry away the jars, usually dumping them into pits outside the village. Sometimes the waste may have been reused as fertilizer, especially in agricultural settings. While not glamorous, it provided a cycle that tied human life back to the soil. What stands out is the presence of these toilets across different households. They were not exclusive to palaces or temples. Even ordinary workers sometimes had access to them. This suggests that while Egyptian sanitation was not technically advanced, it was widespread. A carved stone seat placed above a pot was considered a normal feature of a house, much like a hearth or a bed. Yet sanitation in Egypt was not just practical, it was also ritual. Cleanliness had deep spiritual meaning in Egyptian life. Priests, for example, were expected to purify themselves before entering temple service. They shaved their bodies, washed frequently, and followed strict rituals of cleanliness. In this world, the act of eliminating waste was not merely a biological necessity, it was tied to larger ideas about purity and the order of life. Within temples, evidence suggests there were designated latrine areas for priests. These were not lavish, but functional. Stone seats and pits tucked away, perhaps in side chambers or courtyards. For the Egyptians, bodily functions could not be ignored even in sacred spaces. What mattered was how they were managed, contained, and separated from the holy rituals carried out before the gods. This balance between the sacred and the practical is fascinating. Imagine a sprawling temple complex, its walls painted with myths of creation and afterlife journeys, priests chanting hymns to Ra or Amun, and somewhere nearby, a modest latrine room. Civilization has always required both grandeur and pragmatism. The temple was for eternity, the toilet was for the moment. Yet both were necessary to sustain life. Another detail that adds color to the picture is the use of cleansing materials. Without toilet paper, Egyptians relied on alternatives. Archaeological finds suggest they may have used sand, smooth pottery shards known as ostraca, or bundles of straw. In some cases, water may have been used, particularly in temple contexts where purity was important. Though unusual to modern ears, these methods were effective within their world. Beyond homes and temples, sanitation in Egypt also played a role in cities. Places like Amarna, the short-lived capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten, reveal signs of designated waste areas. Archaeologists have uncovered pits filled with discarded vessels, ash, and organic matter. These may have been dumping grounds for household latrines. The close clustering of these pits suggests a shared solution. Rather than each house managing waste entirely on its own, neighbors may have used common disposal areas. This hints at a subtle but important truth. Egyptian urban life was constantly negotiating with its environment. The Nile gave life, but it also demanded balance. Too much waste in the river could contaminate water. Too little attention to sanitation in crowded cities could spread disease. The Egyptians may not have had the advanced drains of the Indus Valley, but they did create small systems of management, pits, jars, and shared dumping areas that kept their settlements livable. It is worth noting that Egyptian art and texts rarely mention toilets. The grand inscriptions on tomb walls and temple pylons focused on the eternal, on gods, on pharaohs, on journeys through the afterlife. Daily life, including sanitation, was considered too ordinary for such monumental records. Yet ostraca, the pottery shards used for everyday writing, sometimes contain casual sketches and notes that bring us closer to real life. In a few cases, drawings of people relieving themselves have been found, humorous reminders that no society, however grand, escapes the ordinary. There is also a curious connection between toilets and the afterlife. In the Book of the Dead and other funerary texts, the body was seen as something that had to be purified before it could journey into eternity. Waste, impurity, and dirt were symbolic obstacles to be cleansed away. While physical toilets are rarely mentioned, the idea of expelling what was unclean had a deep spiritual echo. To relieve oneself was, in a sense, to participate in the eternal rhythm of order over chaos. Archaeologists working in Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans who built the Valley of the King's Tombs, have found dozens of small toilets. Here, The workers who carved out the tombs of pharaohs lived with their families in modest stone houses. Their latrines were tucked into corners, practical and unadorned. When we walk through these ruins today, we can still see the stone seats, sometimes still set over clay jars. It is a humbling reminder. Even those who created the resting places of kings needed a place of rest themselves. It also shows that sanitation was democratized in Egypt. While Mesopotamian toilets leaned toward the wealthy and Indus Valley drains reflected collective planning, Egypt's approach was household-based. Each family had a small, manageable system. It was simple, but it worked. And because it worked, it persisted for centuries. There is another dimension worth considering, the social aspect of waste removal. The jars had to be emptied, and this task usually fell to servants or lower-ranking members of the household. For them, sanitation was labor. It was repetitive, dirty, and largely invisible. Just as builders raised pyramids for the glory of kings, other workers carried jars of waste to disposal pits. Civilization rested on both. At the same time, the rhythm of sanitation reflected Egypt's reliance on cycles. Just as the Nile flooded each year to renew the soil, waste was removed regularly to renew the household. The act may not have been ceremonial, but in a way, it echoed the larger cycles of Egyptian life. Everything was about balance between river and desert, order and chaos, purity and impurity. Toilets, humble as they were, played a role in maintaining that balance. When we think of Egypt's great monuments, it is easy to forget these smaller details. Yet the stone toilet seats of Deir el-Medina tell us just as much about the lives of ordinary Egyptians as the pyramids tell us about their kings. In those seats and jars, we see not the eternal, but the everyday. And it is the everyday that truly sustained the civilization. As you imagine the sands of Egypt tonight, picture not only the pyramids rising against the sky, but also the quiet interiors of village homes. Picture a family gathered in a courtyard, a jar being carried out to the edge of town, and a stone seat tucked into a corner. These were the silent foundations of Egyptian life. They may not glitter like gold, but they are part of the same story. The story of how people lived, endured, and sought order in a world of both beauty and necessity. When we drift into the world of ancient Greece, we often imagine philosophers debating under shaded colonnades, athletes competing in shining arenas, and temples gleaming with marble under the Aegean sun. But beyond the drama of theatre and the chants of democracy, ordinary life pressed on. Among its rhythms was the matter of sanitation, a subject as constant as it was unspoken. And in Greece, this ordinary reality developed in ways that were both practical and surprisingly social. Unlike the private toilets of Egypt or the hidden household arrangements of Mesopotamia, Greek sanitation leaned heavily toward the public. The Greeks lived much of their lives in communal spaces. Markets, theatres, and baths formed the heart of civic identity, and latrines often followed the same pattern. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of large, shared facilities. Stone benches lined with holes, placed side by side, sometimes numbering 20 or more. Beneath these benches, channels carried waste away, often flushed by running water. These public latrines were not simply functional, they reflected the Greek preference for life lived together. Where the agora served as a marketplace of goods and ideas, the latrine became a quieter forum of necessity. People sat in proximity, divided only by modest partitions, if any. Privacy, as we know it today, was less emphasized. In Greek thought, the body was a natural instrument, not something to be hidden in shame. This made collective use of latrines far less awkward than it might seem from our modern view. At some sites, terracotta pipes carried fresh water into these latrines. A steady trickle rinsed channels beneath the seats, guiding waste out of the building. This use of water, though not universal across Greece, showed an appreciation for cleanliness, that echoed their love of baths and gymnasium. It was not only about convenience, but also about health. Stagnant waste could breed disease. Flowing water carried it away. One striking element of Greek latrines is their integration with bathhouses. Archaeologists in cities such as Athens, Corinth, and Delos have found latrines built near or within public bathing complexes. The connection makes sense. After the rituals of exercise and cleansing, facilities for bodily needs were close at hand. This pairing reveals a holistic view. Caring for the body included washing, resting, and relieving oneself, all in spaces designed for community. But sanitation was not limited to grand civic centers. In smaller homes, especially in rural villages, people often relied on simple chamber pots. These clay vessels could be carried and emptied, much like those in Egypt. The difference lay in urban design. In denser Greek towns, narrow streets sometimes featured drainage channels running between houses. Rainwater and wastewater mixed together, eventually emptying into larger sewers or natural streams. It was a basic but effective way to keep homes from flooding with waste. Still, the public latrine remains the most distinctive feature of Greek sanitation. To picture one, imagine a rectangular hall, its stone benches running along the walls. Sunlight filtered through an opening in the roof, while the faint sound of water trickled in the channels below. Citizens would enter, sit, and conduct their business without much fuss. For them, it was an extension of civic life, another place where people came together, bound by the shared realities of being human. Interestingly, the tools of hygiene were also communal. Instead of toilet paper, the Greeks used items like small stones or ceramic fragments called pessoi. These smooth pieces were held in the hand and used for wiping. Archaeological finds even show inscriptions on some of these fragments, sometimes carved with the names of disliked political figures, turning sanitation into a subtle act of satire. To use a shard etched with an opponent's name was both practical and humorous, a small jab in the theatre of daily life. There are also records of sponge sticks, known later in Roman times, which may have had earlier Greek origins. These were wooden sticks tipped with a sponge, rinsed in water after use. If employed in shared latrines, they would have been kept in buckets of water or vinegar for cleaning. While the thought might seem unsettling today, it illustrates how sanitation was embedded in social practice rather than private ritual. The Greek emphasis on moderation and balance extended to sanitation as well. Philosophers like Hippocrates, who studied the causes of disease, noted the importance of air, water, and cleanliness in maintaining health. Though he did not describe latrines in detail, his teachings on hygiene encouraged attention to waste and its dangers. This intellectual awareness added weight to the practical systems already in place. Urban centers, such as Athens, faced particular challenges. Crowded populations created greater volumes of waste. To manage this, networks of drains were constructed, some running beneath streets. These channels carried both stormwater and sewage, reducing the risk of contamination. In the famous port of Piraeus, archaeologists have traced sections of stone-built sewers dating to the classical period. These were not vast underground labyrinths like those later built in Rome, but they marked a clear step toward organized urban sanitation. One cannot ignore the symbolic side of Greek sanitation. For a culture so deeply concerned with the harmony of body and spirit, the act of elimination carried philosophical undertones. The body was seen as a vessel that required balance, intake and release, nourishment and cleansing. To relieve oneself was part of maintaining that balance. Public latrines, therefore, were not just physical spaces but reflections of a worldview that placed the body in harmony with the rhythms of nature and community. And yet, there was humor as well. Greek comedy often poked fun at bodily functions, turning toilets into material for laughter. In plays by Aristophanes, Jokes about digestion and elimination were common, reflecting an acceptance of the body's realities. For audiences, these references were not crude but relatable, grounding lofty political satire in everyday experience. Sanitation, it seems, was never far from the Greek imagination. One fascinating detail is the way children learned these customs. Archaeological evidence suggests smaller pots were used for young ones, and in some households, children's waste may have been buried or dumped separately. As they grew, they would join their elders in using communal facilities. In this sense, sanitation was part of social education, another step in becoming a citizen of the polis. When we reflect on Greek toilets today, their openness can feel foreign. We are accustomed to walls, doors, and solitude. But in the Greek world, where so much of life unfolded in the public eye, shared latrines were simply an extension of civic identity. Just as debates in the agora and rituals in the theatre bound people together, so too did these quiet, functional spaces. Imagine then walking through the streets of an ancient Greek city. The scent of bread drifts from a bakery, the voices of merchants rise in the agora, and children run through alleys. Amid these sounds, a bathhouse door opens, and inside, alongside the pools and steam, a row of stone benches waits. Citizens enter, sit and leave again, their needs met in the company of others. It is humble, yet it is part of the grand mosaic of Greek life. Sanitation does not glitter like marble statues or echo like Homer's verses. But without it, the polis could not thrive. The drains beneath the streets, the pots within homes, the benches of public latrines. These were the hidden foundations of a civilization that valued harmony, community, and health. In their quiet way, they sustained the brilliance of Greek culture, ensuring that the city could function, breathe, and grow. And as you rest tonight, drifting deeper into calm, you can picture those benches under the Mediterranean sun, water whispering through the channels below, and citizens of long ago living their lives. Great or humble, each was bound by the same truth, that the care of the body is inseparable from the care of the soul. Even in the simplest acts, they found a rhythm that carried their civilization forward. When the story of sanitation reaches Rome, it finds its most ambitious chapter. The Romans, masters of engineering and organization, transformed the simple act of waste removal into a cornerstone of civilization. For them, cleanliness was not only a matter of comfort, but also a mark of Roman identity, proof that their empire stood above the rest of the world. Step into the bustling streets of Rome in the 1st century CE. The air hums with sound, merchants calling in the forum, chariots rattling across cobblestones, fountains splashing cool water. Beneath this lively surface, an invisible system works tirelessly: the sewers. Chief among them was the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, begun in the 6th century BCE under the Etruscan kings and expanded across generations. At first, this mighty channel was simply a drainage ditch, intended to dry out the marshy ground of the Roman Forum, but over time it became a vast underground river of stone and brick, carrying both stormwater and human waste out to the Tiber River. Unlike the modest drains of Greece, the Cloaca Maxima was monumental in scale, so large that workers could descend into it, torches in hand, to clear debris. Even today, parts of it still run beneath modern Rome. The sewer was not an isolated marvel. Across the empire, aqueducts brought fresh water into cities, feeding fountains, baths, and latrines. These two systems, supply and removal, worked together in harmony. Flowing water was the lifeblood of Rome, keeping public spaces fresh and allowing an unprecedented level of cleanliness. In the words of later historians, water was Rome's true luxury, more precious than gold. The public latrine became a symbol of this achievement. Roman cities featured grand facilities, often attached to bathhouses where dozens of people could sit side by side. Stone or marble benches ran along the walls, punctuated with evenly spaced openings. Beneath them flowed channels of running water, carrying waste away. In front of the seats, another channel trickled steadily, where users dipped sponges fixed to sticks, the tersoria, for cleansing. These sponges, rinsed and reused, served the same role as paper does today. Imagine one of these latrines in use. The floor is paved with mosaics, the walls adorned with frescoes. Light streams through high windows, and the murmur of conversation fills the air. Friends greet one another, news is exchanged, jokes are shared. In Roman culture, privacy was far less prized in such matters. The latrine was not merely functional, it was social. Some historians describe it as a kind of informal club, where politics and gossip flowed as freely as the water beneath the benches. And yet, this openness was balanced with remarkable engineering. Constant water flow reduced odors, while careful gradients ensured steady drainage. Ventilation shafts allowed air to circulate, preventing dangerous buildups of gas. For its time, the Roman latrine was an elegant solution, blending practicality with communal life. Beyond the public facilities, wealthier homes sometimes featured private toilets. These were usually small rooms adjoining the kitchen, since both required access to water and drains. Waste often emptied into cesspits or small sewers, later flushed by discarded kitchen water. For the elite, a private toilet was a luxury, but for the masses, public facilities remained the norm. The baths played an equally vital role. Romans loved bathing not just as hygiene but as ritual and leisure. Vast complexes, such as the baths of Caracalla, included everything from hot and cold pools to exercise yards, libraries and gardens. Sanitation was central to these spaces. Water circulated constantly, waste channels carried excess away, and attendants ensured cleanliness. To bathe in Rome was to participate in the civic life of the empire, and sanitation made it possible. Roman writers themselves commented on these achievements. The architect Vitruvius described methods for constructing drains and placing latrines. Seneca, though often critical of luxury, noted the abundance of water as a defining feature of Rome. Pliny the Elder marveled at the aqueducts, calling them among the greatest works of human ingenuity. To the Romans, sanitation was not hidden. It was celebrated, a mark of their superiority. But sanitation in Rome was not without challenges. Crowded tenements, known as insulae, often lacked proper toilets. Residents used chamber pots, sometimes emptied out of windows into the streets below. This created hazards despite the city's grand sewers. Municipal regulations tried to curb the problem, but urban density made enforcement difficult. The contrast between the grandeur of public works and the reality of daily life reveals the complexity of Roman sanitation. Even so, Rome attempted solutions. Street cleaners, called scopari, swept waste away. Public urinals and amphorae, known as fulones jars, collected urine for industrial use. Urine, rich in ammonia, was a valuable ingredient in tanning leather and washing clothes. The Emperor Vespasian famously taxed this collection, leading to the phrase pecunia non olet. Money does not stink. It was a reminder that even waste had value in the Roman economy. Outside Rome, sanitation spread with the empire. Cities from Britannia to North Africa adopted sewers, aqueducts, and bathhouses. In Pompeii, latrines connected to local drains, while fountains splashed at street corners. In Gaul, amphitheatres stood beside baths fed by distant aqueducts. Wherever Rome went, its sanitation followed, shaping urban life across continents. The military also benefited. Roman forts included orderly latrines, sometimes flushed by diverted streams. Soldiers lived in conditions far cleaner than many enemies, giving them not just physical health, but also morale. Sanitation was part of Rome's discipline, a quiet weapon in its arsenal of empire. One fascinating detail lies in the religious dimension. The goddess Cloacina, protector of the Cloaca Maxima, was worshipped near the Forum. Small shrines honored her, acknowledging the divine role in such practical matters. To the Romans, even the sewer had sacred guardians. Cleanliness, then, was not merely civic duty, but part of cosmic order. As centuries passed, however, these systems faced neglect. After the empire's decline, maintenance faltered. Aqueducts broke, sewers clogged, and public baths fell silent. Medieval cities inherited the shells of Roman works but lacked the resources to keep them alive. The memory of Rome's sanitation lingered, but its brilliance dimmed until rediscovered centuries later. To rest tonight with Rome in mind is to picture a city alive with water. Fountains sparkle in the sun, aqueducts stride across valleys, and beneath the streets the great sewer flows endlessly. Citizens gather in marble halls, sharing conversation above the sound of rushing channels. It is a world where sanitation is not hidden in shame, but celebrated as civic pride. Rome's genius lay not only in conquest or law, but in its vision of community, and sanitation was central to that vision. By managing the most basic needs with elegance and scale, they built cities that could thrive, endure, and astonish. Even now their aqueducts still stand, and their sewers still whisper, carrying forward the legacy of water, cleanliness, and life. So as you settle deeper into rest, imagine that underground river beneath ancient Rome, cool, constant, and enduring. It is a reminder that civilization is built not just on monuments, but on the unseen systems that let people live together. And in Rome, that unseen system was turned into an art form, a triumph as vital as any temple or triumphal arch. Long before Rome built its mighty sewers, another civilization quietly mastered the art of sanitation. Along the banks of the Indus River, in the lands that are today Pakistan and northwest India, a society flourished nearly 5,000 years ago. Known to us as the Indus Valley Civilization, or Harappan Civilization, it was one of the world's earliest urban cultures. And at its heart lay something remarkable, an obsession with cleanliness and order. Step into Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro around 2500 BCE. The streets are laid out in a grid, straight and deliberate, unlike the winding alleys of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Each block is planned, every intersection aligned. This was no haphazard settlement. It was city design of astonishing foresight. And running through this design was a hidden web of drains, channels, and bathing areas that made the Indus cities some of the cleanest of the ancient world. One of the first things archaeologists noticed in Mohenjo-Daro was the presence of standardized bricks. Each brick was fired to precise dimensions, allowing them to fit together tightly in walls, drains, and platforms. It was this uniformity that made their sanitation so effective. Covered drains ran along major streets built from these baked bricks and often topped with stone slabs. Household wastewater flowed into them, channeled away to larger sewers, and eventually released outside the city. Few civilizations of the time had anything like it. Inside the houses, too, sanitation was advanced. Many homes had bathing platforms made of bricks, sometimes with a small step up to keep the floor dry. Wastewater from bathing flowed into clay pipes or open drains that linked with the street sewers. Some houses even had private toilets. Simple but ingenious structures that emptied into cesspits or directly into the municipal drainage. Imagine this. 5,000 years ago, families in Mohenjo-Daro could relieve themselves in a private space and know that waste would be carried away, not left to fester near the home. The most striking structure of all was the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro. This massive tank, about 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, was built with meticulous care. Its floor was lined with baked bricks, sealed with bitumen to keep it watertight. Staircases descended into the water from both ends, and a sophisticated system of drains managed the inflow and outflow. Scholars debate its exact use. Was it for ritual purification, communal bathing, or both? Whatever its purpose, it reveals a culture that linked water, cleanliness, and perhaps even spirituality in a profound way. Water indeed played a central role in the Indus worldview. Wells dotted the cities, supplying fresh water to neighborhoods. Unlike Mesopotamia, where water was often controlled by elites or temples, in the Indus cities wells were widely distributed. Access to clean water seemed a right, not a privilege. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of wells in Mohenjo-daro alone, suggesting a society deeply invested in ensuring regular, clean supply. This emphasis on water and cleanliness suggests more than practicality. It hints at cultural values. In later Indian traditions, ritual purity became a cornerstone of daily life. Bathing in rivers, washing before prayers, and separating clean from unclean objects shaped Hindu practice for millennia. While the Indus people left no deciphered texts to explain their beliefs, the scale of their sanitation suggests that ideas of purity were already deeply rooted. Perhaps the Great Bath was a sacred prototype of rituals that later unfolded on the banks of the Ganges. Another striking feature was waste disposal. In many ancient cities, refuse piled up in streets or was thrown outside walls. But in Harappan sites, archaeologists have found designated dumping areas and evidence of municipal control. This suggests organized civic administration. Someone or some group oversaw the cleanliness of the city, ensuring that drains were built, repaired, and cleared. It was not merely individual households acting alone, it was a communal effort. The sophistication extended even to smaller settlements. Sites like Kalibangan and Lothal reveal drains and bathing platforms on a smaller scale, showing that sanitation was not limited to the great urban centers. Even in trading towns and ports, the same concern for water management appears. Lothal, with its famous dockyard, had drains to carry waste away from workshops and homes, keeping the trading hub functional and healthy. And yet, for all their brilliance, mysteries remain. Who organized this sanitation system? Was it the work of rulers, priests, or councils of elders? No grand palaces or royal tombs have been found, unlike in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Power in the Indus Valley seems less centralized, more communal. Perhaps sanitation itself was part of that communal ethos, a shared responsibility woven into the very identity of the city. As the centuries passed, the Indus cities declined. Around 1900 BCE, many urban centers were abandoned. Scholars debate the causes: climate shifts, river changes, invasions, or disease. With their decline, the elaborate sanitation systems fell silent. Later cultures in the subcontinent built differently, and while water and purity remained central themes, the scale of Harappan sanitation was not seen again for centuries. Yet echoes of it lived on. By the time of the Vedic age, ritual bathing in rivers had become a sacred act. The Ganges and Yamuna were revered as purifying waters. Over time, entire traditions grew around the cleansing power of water. Pilgrimages to sacred rivers, bathing before ceremonies, and the separation of pure and impure all became part of Indian life. Though centuries had passed since Mohenjo-daro, the spirit of sanitation, the marriage of water, cleanliness, and the sacred, endured. In later classical India, texts like the Manusmriti included rules about waste disposal, washing, and hygiene. Town planning manuals such as the Arthashastra prescribed guidelines for the placement of wells, drains, and disposal pits. Though not as uniform as the Harappan grid, the concern for sanitation was still present. showing that the ancient commitment to order and cleanliness had never fully disappeared. What makes the Indus Valley especially striking is how far ahead it was for its time. When much of the world still lived in villages with little sanitation, these people engineered cities with covered drains, private toilets, and public baths. It was not simply technology, it was vision. They imagined a city where water and waste were managed for all, where cleanliness was a civic norm, not an afterthought. As you drift deeper into rest, picture one of those ancient streets. A row of brick houses stands in neat alignment. At the corner, a well provides fresh water. A child pours a bucket over a brick platform, and the water disappears into a drain. Nearby, men and women walk toward the great bath, their steps echoing on baked brick. Below the street, unseen, channels carry waste away, leaving the city clean and ordered. It is a humbling thought. 5,000 years ago, before aqueducts, before Roman sewers, before Greek fountains, the people of the Indus Valley lived in cities that valued sanitation as much as trade or agriculture. Their drains may be buried now, their writing undeciphered, their gods forgotten, but their vision of cleanliness lives on in every modern system that carries water in and waste away. In their silence, the Indus people left us a message written not in words but in bricks and water. Civilization is not only temples and walls but also the unseen currents that keep life clean and whole. And in that message they remain forever modern, forever ahead of their time. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine that flow beneath the streets of Mohenjo-daro. Steady, unseen, constant. It is the heartbeat of a city that once dreamed of cleanliness, a dream that still flows quietly through the world today. When we think of ancient China, our minds often leap to dynasties, walls, and philosophies. To the emperors who ruled vast territories, to Confucius, whose words still echo, to silk and porcelain carried westward along trade routes. Yet beneath the great sweep of history, another story unfolded quietly. The daily effort to keep life clean, orderly, and sustainable. In its own way, China developed some of the most practical and enduring sanitation systems of the ancient world. The earliest Chinese settlements, scattered along the Yellow River, were built in a challenging environment. Floods swept across the plains and silt turned the water opaque. Managing water was never optional here. It was essential. Early communities dug wells to secure clean sources, often lined with wood or stone to prevent collapse. Archaeologists at sites like Early II, a Bronze Age culture sometimes linked with the legendary Xia dynasty, have uncovered wells positioned within neighborhoods, providing safe, shared access to fresh water. The placement of wells was deliberate, reflecting both practicality and an understanding of hygiene. By the time of the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, urban settlements displayed increasing sophistication in their handling of waste and water. Excavations at Anyang, the last Shang capital, reveal not only palaces and ritual pits, but also drainage ditches and wells distributed through the city. These were not incidental features. They were as much a part of urban design as walls and streets. Wastewater was channeled into ditches outside the settlement, keeping living spaces relatively clear. Though simple, these systems show the beginnings of organized sanitation. Later dynasties expanded on this foundation. The Zhou, who succeeded the Shang, placed great emphasis on order and ritual, and this extended into urban planning. Texts like the Zhou Li, or Rites of Zhou, describe ideal city layouts where the placement of wells, streets, and waste areas was regulated. The grid-like arrangement with communal wells serving groups of households reinforced a sense of shared responsibility. Clean water was not left to chance. It was built into the framework of daily life. One of China's most distinctive contributions to sanitation came from agriculture, the recycling of human waste. Unlike many ancient cultures that saw excrement only as a problem to be removed, Chinese farmers recognized its value. Collected in pits and containers, human waste was transported to fields and used as fertilizer. Over centuries, this practice became so ingrained that it shaped both rural and urban life. In villages, night soil, as it came to be called, was gathered each morning, ensuring that waste did not accumulate dangerously near homes. In cities, systems of collection developed, with workers tasked with removing and transporting waste for agricultural use. This recycling was not only pragmatic, but sustainable. The constant replenishing of soil nutrients allowed intensive farming to support large populations. It also kept waste from festering untreated in urban areas. While by modern standards it posed risks of contamination, within the context of the time it was remarkably efficient, turning what might have been a hazard into a resource. The Han Dynasty, beginning in 206 BCE, brought further advances. In cities like Chang'an, the capital, archaeologists have found evidence of early toilet structures. Simple but functional. Some were built as pits lined with clay or stone, others as raised platforms with openings that led to containers or cesspits. A few elite households even had water-flushed latrines, rudimentary but recognizable ancestors of modern toilets. The technology was basic, often a trough with water poured through. Yet the principle was there, using water to carry waste away from living spaces. Excavations at ancient sites have revealed something else extraordinary: preserved remains of wooden or ceramic seats placed over pits, showing a concern for comfort as well as utility. These details remind us that sanitation was not just about engineering, it was also about the lived experience of individuals, about dignity and daily routine. Alongside toilets and cesspits, wells remained central to Chinese sanitation. Many neighborhoods shared large wells, sometimes brick-lined, that lasted generations. Records from the Han describe officials responsible for overseeing wells, ensuring they were maintained and uncontaminated. In some places, laws regulated how close waste pits could be dug to drinking sources, an early recognition of the dangers of pollution. As centuries passed, China's urban landscapes grew more complex, and so did sanitation systems. In the Tang dynasty, when Chang'an was one of the world's largest cities, the management of water and waste reached new levels of organization. The city's layout was carefully ordered into wards and streets, each with wells and drainage. Government records mention officials tasked with cleaning ditches, maintaining drains, and ensuring that waste did not clog waterways. The scale of this management reflected not only administrative capacity, but also an understanding that a city of 1 million people could not survive without systematic sanitation. In smaller towns and villages, the story was quieter but no less important. The collection of night soil became a routine profession, with families often specializing in the trade. Containers were placed outside homes, collected at dawn, and carried to nearby farms. The rhythm of this cycle tied city and countryside together. Farmers relied on urban waste to fertilize their crops, while townspeople depended on farmers for food. Sanitation, in this sense, was woven directly into the fabric of Chinese society. Water management also intersected with ritual life. Cleanliness carried moral and spiritual weight in Chinese thought. Confucian texts emphasized personal discipline, which included physical hygiene. Taoist practices encouraged bathing and purification as ways of aligning with natural harmony. Even in the design of gardens and temples, flowing water symbolized balance, renewal, and purity. Wells and streams were not just practical, but imbued with cultural meaning. Another remarkable feature of Chinese sanitation was its continuity. While many civilizations developed sanitation systems only to see them collapse with political decline, China's practices endured and evolved across dynasties. The Qin, the Han, the Tang, the Song all carried forward variations of well placement, waste collection, and water management. Even when dynasties fell, the habits of daily life persisted. This continuity meant that sanitation in China was not a fragile innovation, but a stable tradition capable of sustaining immense populations over centuries. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the sophistication of ancient Chinese sanitation. At a site in Xianyang, once the Qin capital, researchers found a large ceramic toilet dating to over 2,000 years ago, connected to what appears to be an early sewage system. The discovery suggests that elite households may have enjoyed surprisingly modern conveniences long before similar technologies appeared in other parts of the world. At another site, evidence of filtration systems shows attempts to keep wells free from debris and contaminants. Clay jars placed upside down with holes punched through acted as rudimentary filters, demonstrating both ingenuity and an awareness of water quality. Such small details, invisible in grand histories, show how much thought went into preserving health and cleanliness. As you drift deeper into calm, imagine walking through a Han Dynasty courtyard. In one corner, a well rises, its brick rim worn smooth by countless hands lowering buckets. Nearby, a modest toilet stands over a pit, its structure simple but effective. In the early morning, a worker passes by collecting containers of night soil, carrying them out of the city to the waiting fields. The routine is ordinary, almost invisible, yet it sustains both the city and the countryside. What makes the Chinese approach to sanitation so distinctive is its pragmatism. Where some cultures built monumental baths or sewers as symbols of power, China wove sanitation into everyday life. Wells, drains, toilets, collection systems. They were not grandiose but practical, serving the needs of ordinary families as much as elites. It was this grounded approach that allowed sanitation to endure, not as a relic of one age, but as a living thread across millennia. Tonight, as you close your eyes, picture those wells and drains, those clay-lined pits and wooden toilet seats, those morning collectors making their rounds. Picture the rhythm of water drawn, waste removed, fields nourished, and cities kept clean. It is not the story of kings or battles, but of quiet systems that allowed life to flourish, generation after generation. And in that rhythm we glimpse the wisdom of ancient China. That civilization is not only built with walls and armies, but with the unseen flows of water and waste that sustain the lives of millions. The Renaissance is often remembered for its art, architecture, and rediscovery of classical learning. But behind the grand palaces and cathedrals, life was just as messy as in the Middle Ages. The era may have brought Leonardo's sketches, Michelangelo's sculptures, and Shakespeare's plays, but it also carried an odour that hung over Europe. And toilets, or the lack of them, remained a central part of daily discomfort. Let's begin in Italy, where the rebirth of knowledge coincided with a growing awareness of urban planning. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome attracted scholars, merchants, and nobles, but the infrastructure rarely kept pace. Open gutters continued to carry waste down streets, and even in homes of the wealthy, toilets were hardly luxurious. Nobles often had private garderobes tucked into the walls of their estates. These spaces were little more than wooden seats built over chutes that directed waste into the street or into cesspits below. Servants were expected to clean these pits, an unpleasant job that often required hauling the waste out by hand and carting it away at night. Public latrines existed, especially in larger cities, but they were rudimentary. In Venice, some toilets were perched over canals, with the water serving as a convenient but foul means of disposal. Locals nicknamed these facilities necessariae, a practical label for an unglamorous need. Yet Venetian officials began to worry about pollution. Too much waste in the canals not only created unbearable smells but also threatened trade, since merchants arriving by boat would encounter the city's filth firsthand. Regulations were sometimes introduced, demanding cesspits or banning chamber pot dumping, but enforcement was weak. North of Italy, the situation was no cleaner. In Renaissance France, Paris had hundreds of thousands of residents by the 1500s, yet public toilets were scarce. People continued to use chamber pots and dispose of them in the street. City ordinances forbade such behavior, but cries of "Gardez l'eau," warning passers-by below before tossing the pot, were still a common sound in narrow Parisian alleys. Some scholars suggest that this daily risk of being splashed influenced French fashion, with wide-brimmed hats and layered cloaks offering protection from more than just the weather. Even in the palaces of kings, toilets left much to be desired. At the Louvre in Paris, long before it became an art museum, the royal family lived amid grandeur but also stench. Accounts tell us that waste was often left in corners of courtyards or thrown into the Seine. Visitors complained of the smell, but little changed until much later. Toilets existed, but they were sparse, often communal, and cleaned irregularly. Hygiene lagged far behind the ideals of beauty and symmetry that dominated Renaissance art. In England, the Tudors faced similar issues. Henry VIII's court was notorious for its banquets and indulgences, but behind the feasting lay the practical matter of waste. Hampton Court Palace, one of Henry's great residences, included a communal toilet known as the Great House of Easement. This facility had seats for over 24 people, side by side, with waste dropping into a pit below. It might sound like progress. After all, it was large and purpose-built, but it came with little privacy and plenty of odour. The pit had to be cleaned periodically, a job given to gong farmers. These men worked at night, shoveling out the filth by lantern light. They were paid well because the work was so dangerous. The fumes could suffocate a worker, and more than one gong farmer lost consciousness or even died in the pits. Ordinary Londoners had fewer options. Privies were scattered around the city, but they filled quickly, and cesspits overflowed. The Thames itself became the ultimate dumping ground, carrying the city's waste downstream. By the mid-1500s, observers complained that the water was too polluted to drink, yet it remained a common source of both drinking water and disposal. Diseases like dysentery and typhoid thrived in such conditions. Moving further east in the Ottoman Empire, cities like Istanbul began to experiment with more organized waste systems. The Ottomans valued public baths, known as hammams, as places of hygiene, relaxation, and social gathering. Alongside these baths, public toilets were often built, offering facilities to travelers and locals alike. Unlike Europe, where chamber pots and cesspits dominated, Ottoman toilets were more closely aligned with what we might recognize today. Squat-style latrines connected to drainage channels were common, reflecting an Islamic emphasis on cleanliness and ritual washing. Still, the system was imperfect, and poorer districts struggled with waste disposal. Yet compared to many European cities, Ottoman practices stood out as more sanitary. The Renaissance also brought about new kinds of records, travel diaries, civic documents, architectural drawings that give us glimpses into toilet culture. One fascinating example comes from Northern Europe, where scholars began to write about the privy in their accounts of daily life. Some German towns constructed public facilities with multiple seats, covered roofs, and wooden partitions. They weren't luxurious, but they represented an attempt to provide urban infrastructure at a time when cities were growing rapidly. Another curious development during this era was the connection between waste and agriculture. Human waste, often referred to as night soil, became a valuable fertilizer. Farmers collected it from cities and spread it on fields, closing a cycle that had existed in some form for centuries. In Renaissance Japan, for instance, human waste was considered so valuable that landlords could charge tenants for the right to collect it. In Europe, the practice was less formalized, but the link between city waste and rural fields grew more important as populations expanded. This connection also reinforced the need for cesspits, storage areas that kept waste until it could be carted out to the countryside. We might also pause to consider how attitudes toward privacy evolved in this period. The communal toilet, common in both palaces and towns, reflected an older view of human needs as social rather than solitary. Yet by the late Renaissance, the idea of a private chamber, whether for sleeping, studying, or relieving oneself, became more popular among the elite. Architecture began to reflect this shift, with small private garderobes tucked near bedrooms. It was a step toward the more private bathrooms of later centuries, though still far from the modern sense of comfort. Even so, most people continued to live with smells and mess that were simply part of life. Diaries and letters from the 1500s and 1600s mention foul streets, overflowing pits, and the unpleasant duty of using a chamber pot. But people adapted. Perfumes, herbs, and incense were used to mask odors. Wealthy households placed bowls of lavender, rosemary, or citrus peels in garderobes to soften the stench. These efforts remind us that people of the past were not unaware of the problem. They just lacked the technology to truly solve it. As the Renaissance gave way to the early modern era, waste disposal became a matter of public health. Plagues swept through Europe repeatedly, and while people didn't yet understand germs, they suspected that filth played a role. Cities began to regulate cesspits more carefully and to experiment with new forms of drainage. Yet progress was slow, and centuries would pass before true sanitation systems emerged. Still, by the end of the 1600s, the groundwork was being laid. Experiments with flushing mechanisms were appearing in England, courtesy of inventors like Sir John Harrington, who created a rudimentary flush toilet in 1596. His design was admired but rarely copied, mostly because the plumbing needed to support it was too advanced for the time. Yet the seed was planted, and the idea that waste could be carried away with water would eventually transform the world. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries is often remembered as an age of reason, science, and revolution. Philosophers questioned monarchies, scientists charted the stars, and writers proposed radical new ideas about government and society. But beneath the lofty ideals of liberty and reason, everyday people still had to deal with one unavoidable fact: waste. The toilet problem remained unsolved, but this was the first period in which scholars, inventors, and city leaders began to seriously consider it as a scientific and civic challenge. For the majority of people across Europe, daily life changed little from the Renaissance. Chamber pots remained the standard household solution. Most city dwellers still dumped their contents into gutters or cesspits. In many towns, the night soilmen, workers tasked with emptying cesspits, were still essential to keeping cities from being overwhelmed. Yet, as Enlightenment thought spread, so did new ideas about cleanliness, air quality, and public health. The Enlightenment was obsessed with order, symmetry, and rationality. Thinkers believed that human environments should reflect harmony, and cities began to be viewed not just as places of commerce, but as systems that required regulation. Toilets, privies, and waste disposal became part of this larger vision of managing society with logic. One major shift was the growing fear of miasma, the belief that disease spread through foul odors and bad air. Doctors and scientists of the time didn't yet understand germs, but they did recognize that filthy conditions were linked to outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and cholera. This belief in miasma encouraged governments to treat waste as a public issue rather than just a private inconvenience. Among the elite, new experiments in toilet design began to emerge. In England, Sir John Harrington's invention of the flush toilet in 1596 had largely been forgotten, but a few households revived similar ideas in the 17th century. Wealthy families experimented with water closets, small rooms where waste could be washed away by a simple mechanism. In France, members of the nobility sometimes had ornate commodes, wooden chairs with removable chamber pots hidden inside. These pieces of furniture were decorated to blend into elegant bedrooms or salons. Guests might not even notice that a fine chair doubled as a toilet. Such contraptions reflected the period's fascination with disguising unpleasant realities beneath layers of refinement. Still, these early flush systems were rare and impractical. Plumbing networks capable of handling them didn't yet exist. Many aristocrats continued to use chamber pots, handing them off to servants who bore the brunt of emptying them. Privacy was still limited. In Versailles, Louis XIV is said to have conducted political business while seated on his commode, surrounded by courtiers. The true challenge of the Enlightenment was urban growth. Cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam expanded rapidly during the 17th and 18th centuries. More people meant more waste, and the problem became increasingly visible. In London, cesspits overflowed frequently. Regulations existed to require households to maintain them, but enforcement was lax. The result was that streets often smelled of sewage, and the Thames River was so polluted that observers described it as an open sewer. Yet London also became a centre of innovation. Engineers began to discuss how water supply and waste removal could be connected. Some proposed covered drains, while others experimented with brick-lined sewers. Paris faced similar struggles. The Seine had long been the dumping ground for waste, and though city officials issued decrees against it, compliance was poor. In 1740, authorities introduced more systematic efforts to clean cesspits and regulate disposal. Yet complaints about the stench of the Seine persisted throughout the century. Foreign visitors often commented on the filth, contrasting Paris's elegance in art and architecture with its overwhelming smells. Amsterdam, with its canals, faced a unique dilemma. Waste often ended up directly in the waterways, but the city also relied on canals for transport and water supply. By the late 1600s, the canals were so polluted that they threatened trade and tourism. Dutch engineers worked constantly to manage the flow of water, flushing canals with river water to dilute the waste. This system wasn't perfect, but it was one of the earliest large-scale attempts to integrate urban infrastructure with waste management. During the Enlightenment, public facilities became a symbol of civic order. Cities began to invest in shared toilets for marketplaces, inns, and busy streets. These were usually simple latrines with wooden seats over pits, but their existence reflected a shift in thinking. Providing toilets was now seen as part of a city's responsibility. At the same time, toilet habits revealed sharp class differences. The wealthy might relieve themselves in ornate commodes lined with silver or porcelain bowls, while the poor continued to use alleys or open fields. Servants carried chamber pots through corridors, sometimes causing embarrassment if an unfortunate spill occurred. Travel diaries from the 18th century describe foreign toilets in detail, often with amusement or disgust. English travellers in Italy complained of open gutters. French visitors to London mocked cesspits, and Germans travelling through Spain noted the casual use of chamber pots even in public settings. These accounts reveal that toilets were not just practical necessities, but cultural curiosities, shaping outsiders' impressions of entire nations. The Enlightenment was a period when science and engineering began to offer real solutions. Though germ theory was still a century away, physicians increasingly linked disease to filth. Municipal councils funded projects to cover drains, regulate cesspit cleaning, and pave streets to prevent waste from seeping into the soil. One fascinating example comes from Edinburgh, Scotland. By the 1700s, the city was notorious for waste disposal. Tenement residents often dumped chamber pots out of upper windows, calling out warnings of "Gardyloo" to pedestrians below. But by mid-century, reformers began lobbying for organised waste collection. The city gradually introduced regulations requiring cesspits to be cleaned more often, setting the stage for larger reforms in the 19th century. The Enlightenment also produced thinkers who imagined radical new urban designs. Architects such as Claude Nicolas Ledoux in France dreamed of planned cities where every detail, from housing to waste disposal, was guided by rational principles. Though most of these projects remained on paper, they reflected the growing belief that sanitation was part of civilization itself. While Europe was struggling with cesspits, other parts of the world had their own traditions. In Japan, night soil continued to be a valuable commodity. Farmers collected it systematically, and waste management was integrated into urban life more effectively than in many European cities. Japanese toilets were often squat-style latrines, with collection systems beneath them, reflecting both practicality and cultural emphasis on cleanliness. In China, large cities used a combination of public latrines and night soil collection. Waste was considered an essential agricultural resource. Though the facilities were simple, the system was organized and widespread. In this sense, East Asian sanitation practices were far more advanced than much of Europe during the Enlightenment. In colonial America, settlers brought European habits with them. Privies, small outhouses with pits, were the norm. Cities like Boston and Philadelphia had ordinances about waste disposal, but enforcement was spotty. In rural areas, farmers often relied on outhouses placed away from wells to avoid contamination. Though modest, these solutions reflected the frontier's emphasis on practicality over refinement. The Enlightenment not only advanced sanitation theories, but also reshaped how toilets were perceived. Manuals of etiquette began to appear, offering advice on when and how to excuse oneself politely. The idea of privacy gained importance, whereas medieval and Renaissance people often used toilets communally. 18th century elites began to treat relieving oneself as an act that should be hidden from view. Furniture makers designed portable commodes disguised as cabinets, ensuring that even in elegant salons a person could take care of necessities discreetly. Chamber pots themselves became fashionable objects, decorated with porcelain, enamel, or fine metalwork. Some were even inscribed with humorous or political slogans, turning them into conversation pieces as well as functional items. By the close of the 18th century, toilets were no longer just a private inconvenience. They were becoming a matter of public debate and scientific inquiry. The miasma theory encouraged reforms. Engineers experimented with covered sewers, and inventors tinkered with flushing devices. Yet, for the average person, the experience of using the toilet hadn't changed much. A chamber pot, a cesspit, or an outhouse remained the standard. Still, the Enlightenment had planted the seed of a revolution. The belief that reason could transform society extended to sanitation. Waste management was now viewed as a mark of civilization, and cities began to imagine cleaner, more rational futures. The true breakthroughs, modern sewers, reliable flushing toilets, and the elimination of cesspits, lay ahead in the industrial age. When most of us imagine a grand medieval castle, we picture towering stone walls, banquet halls lit with flickering torches, and knights pacing across echoing courtyards. But rarely do we stop to think about what it was like when someone inside those walls needed to relieve themselves. And yet, the toilet, or more accurately, the privy, was a daily necessity. The solutions that medieval architects devised were both ingenious and, by modern standards, a little terrifying. One of the most common medieval castle toilets was called the garderobe. The word itself suggests a connection to storage, since clothing was often hung in these small side chambers. People believed that the ammonia rising from the waste below could kill off moths and fleas that plagued fabrics. So, in a strange twist of practicality, you might have hung your finest wool tunic in the very place where the waste of the household collected. The garderobe was usually built as a small, narrow chamber jutting out from the castle wall. Imagine standing in a stone alcove with a hole carved into a stone or wooden bench. Beneath you, gravity did the work. Waste fell down a shaft, often directly into the moat that surrounded the castle. From a defensive standpoint, this had some drawbacks. Enemies who tried to breach the walls sometimes crawled through the very waste chutes meant for sewage. In fact, there are records of sieges where attackers made use of garderobe shafts as secret entry points. Inside the garderobe, the conditions were not pleasant. There was little ventilation apart from the open shaft, and in summer the smell must have been overwhelming. Yet despite the stench, garderobes were considered a sign of luxury compared to the open pits or chamber pots used by common villagers. A lord or lady with access to a private garderobe enjoyed a small degree of convenience and perhaps a sense of status, even if the experience was far from hygienic. Another striking feature of these castle toilets is their precariousness. Imagine leaning over a narrow bench with only a wooden seat between you and a sheer drop of 20 or 30 feet. Accidents did happen. Chroniclers note occasional cases of people slipping and tumbling down the chute. In such instances, the consequences were not just embarrassing, they were often fatal. Falling into a moat filled with waste and possibly sharp debris was not a fate anyone wanted to imagine. Some castles employed a slightly more advanced system known as a cesspit garderobe, where waste collected in a pit instead of dropping into open water. These pits had to be cleaned out by workers known as gong farmers. The word gong referred to the stench, and farmers in this case had nothing to do with fields or crops. Their work was among the most dangerous and despised in medieval society. Armed with buckets and long shovels, they descended into the pits, hauling out the accumulated muck. The gases rising from the decomposing waste could suffocate a person within minutes if they weren't careful. And yet, despite the hazards, gong farmers were reasonably well paid for their grisly task. Someone had to do it, and few were willing. In wealthier castles, garderobes were sometimes built in clusters, forming a medieval version of a communal restroom. Rows of chutes might be aligned side by side, leading to a common pit. Privacy was not a high priority in these designs. Sitting shoulder to shoulder with your fellow courtiers, exchanging gossip or political strategy while relieving yourself was not uncommon. For modern minds accustomed to individual stalls and locked doors, the thought is both amusing and unsettling. Beyond the walls of the castle, monasteries developed their own toilet systems. Known as reredotas, these were long halls with multiple seats set over a running water channel. Monks, who lived lives of routine and discipline, treated even toilet breaks as moments of communal order. Silence was often required, though one wonders how strictly that rule was enforced. Waste was flushed away by diverted streams or conduits, a surprisingly effective solution that minimized the need for manual cleaning. But even within these more organized systems, hazards lingered. Garderobe shafts were breeding grounds for disease. The waste seeping into moats or surrounding fields contaminated water supplies. During sieges, when food and clean water grew scarce, the risk of illness from poorly managed waste rose dramatically. Dysentery, a disease spread through contaminated water, was a common killer of soldiers and civilians alike. In many cases, disease did more to weaken defenders than the weapons of the enemy. Architecturally, garderobes also influenced castle design in subtle ways. Because they jutted out from the walls, they created structural weak points. Attackers sometimes targeted these protruding shafts with battering rams or undermining efforts. At the same time, the placement of garderobes revealed the daily rhythms of castle life, often tucked away near great halls or private chambers, positioned for convenience rather than defense. Not every castle privy was crude. In some cases, elaborate decoration made its way into these small chambers. Carved stone seats, niches for candles, and even small windows have been found in preserved garderobes. The act of relieving oneself may not have been glamorous, but the wealthiest lords could still expect a touch of dignity. Legends and anecdotes about castle toilets abound. One tale tells of a German king who was assassinated while using his privy. Attackers crept up the shaft and struck while he was most vulnerable. Whether true or embellished, the story illustrates just how dangerous these seemingly private spaces could be, and yet for all their faults, garderobes marked an important step in the history of sanitation. They represented an attempt, primitive though it was, to integrate waste disposal into architecture. Rather than scattering chamber pots into the streets or digging shallow pits, castle builders acknowledged that waste had to be managed somehow. In this way, garderobes were the ancestors of the plumbing systems that would come centuries later. When you picture a medieval feast with roasted meats piled high and cups of ale flowing freely, remember that somewhere in the shadows of the castle, garderobes were silently waiting. The stone shafts, the fetid pits, the precarious benches, all were part of daily life. To live in a castle was to live not only with grandeur and protection, but also with the constant reminder that even kings and queens faced the same humbling necessity as everyone else. So next time you imagine a knight striding down a torchlit corridor, or a lady gazing out over the battlements, add a quieter, more human detail to your mental picture. The moment they disappeared into a small, draughty chamber, sat upon a stone seat, and contributed their part to the ever-growing puzzle of waste beneath the castle walls. Japan has always held a curious place in the history of cleanliness and ritual. In much of the world, toilets and sanitation were often treated as afterthoughts, hidden away or neglected, until necessity forced people to confront them. But in Japan for centuries, relieving oneself was never just about biology, it was about balance, respect, and ritual. Tonight, let us wander through the long arc of Japanese toileting history, where even the most ordinary act was woven into layers of meaning. In the earliest communities of the Jomon period, stretching back more than 10,000 years, there is little direct evidence of how waste was handled. Archaeologists, however, have uncovered pits in settlements that seem to have served not only as trash disposal, but also possibly as communal latrines. What makes them different from similar features elsewhere is the care in their construction. They were not just holes in the ground, but sometimes lined with stones or pottery shards, as if order, even in waste, mattered deeply. By the Yayoi period, around 300 BCE to 300 CE, rice cultivation had transformed the Japanese landscape. Wet rice paddies meant irrigation systems, and those same channels occasionally doubled as disposal systems for human waste. But unlike in many other parts of the world where such practices were regarded as shameful or dangerous, in Japan the use of waste in agriculture became normalized. Human waste, euphemistically called night soil, was collected and valued. Farmers saw it as essential fertilizer, so much so that in later centuries, waste would be bartered, sold, and even rented, landlords demanding it as part of tenancy agreements. A household's waste was literally a resource, not something to be discarded thoughtlessly. By the Heian period, around the 8th to 12th centuries, Japan's capital at Kyoto was home to an aristocratic culture that prized refinement. Toileting habits were no exception. In noble households, toilets were often placed carefully within gardens, linked by covered walkways that allowed access while preserving dignity. Water flowed through these toilets to carry waste away, an early form of what we might call flushing. Yet ritual remained at the core. It was considered unclean to use the same facilities for men and women, so separation of spaces was strictly maintained. Even in waste, decorum was vital. Shinto beliefs played a significant role in shaping how toilets were viewed. In Shinto thought, cleanliness is central. Purity must constantly be renewed. The toilet was a liminal space, one that required both respect and caution. Folklore even assigned deities to toilets. One such figure was Kawaya no Kami, the god of the latrine. In older times, when toilets were simple huts built over pits, these gods were thought to dwell in the shadows, requiring appeasement. Families left offerings to ensure safety and health. The reasoning was practical as well as spiritual. Poorly maintained toilets could be dangerous places not only because of disease, but also because of the risk of falling in. Appeasing the deity was both a symbolic and literal safeguard. There were also darker spirits associated with toilets. In Japanese folklore, certain yokai, supernatural beings, were said to lurk in latrines, waiting to startle or harm the careless. Tales warned children not to linger too long, lest a hand reach up from the pit or a spirit whisper from the darkness. These stories may seem eerie, but they carried a cultural weight, teaching caution in spaces that were hazardous but necessary. By the Edo period, stretching from the 17th to the 19th centuries, Japan's system of managing waste had become so advanced that foreign visitors were astonished. In cities like Edo, modern Tokyo, human waste was systematically collected, carted out of town, and sold to farmers. This not only provided rich fertilizer for crops, but also kept the streets cleaner than in most European cities at the time. Western travelers remarked with surprise at how little stench there was compared to London or Paris. What might have seemed shameful in the West was treated in Japan with a matter-of-fact practicality. Toilets themselves evolved during this time. The kawaya, a simple structure over a pit, remained common, but wealthier households often had more refined arrangements, with wooden seats and even designs that allowed flowing water. In urban areas, some toilets were connected to canals, carrying waste away with surprising efficiency. A Japanese home might not have been luxurious by European standards, but in matters of sanitation, it often surpassed them. Rituals of cleanliness extended beyond the toilet itself. After relieving oneself, it was expected to cleanse thoroughly. Early practices included washing with water or wiping with sticks of wood or paper. Japan's early adoption of paper, centuries before it became common in the West, meant that even toileting could involve this material. Rougher than what we know today, it was nonetheless effective, and the practice of using paper eventually spread across the country. The respect afforded to toilets sometimes took poetic form. Japanese literature, especially haiku, often captured the beauty of fleeting, ordinary moments. Even toilets appeared in poetry, not in a crude way, but as part of the natural rhythms of life. Writers noted the sound of water trickling through drains, the hush of footsteps along a garden path leading to a latrine, or even the seasonal chores of cleaning and maintaining such spaces. It might seem strange, but in a culture where daily life was infused with aesthetic awareness, even the humblest toilet could inspire a verse. Moving into the Meiji period of the late 19th century, Japan opened itself to Western influence. Flush toilets, imported from Europe, began to appear in government buildings and the homes of the wealthy. Yet adoption was slow. The squatting style, so ingrained in Japanese custom, persisted, and indeed, squat toilets remain common even today. What's fascinating is how Japan absorbed the new without abandoning the old. Western-style seated toilets gradually spread, but often with unique Japanese twists, bidet functions, warming seats, and meticulous design. The reverence for cleanliness has endured. Even in the 20th and 21st centuries, public restrooms in Japan are renowned worldwide. Travelers often remark that even the most ordinary station toilet in Tokyo is cleaner and more thoughtfully designed than facilities in major cities elsewhere. This is not an accident. It reflects a cultural lineage stretching back millennia. At the center of it all is the ritual of respect. Toilets are not simply mechanical conveniences. They are spaces where one honors hygiene, considers the needs of others, and participates in an unbroken chain of cultural practice. From the humble kawaya huts of the past to the futuristic smart toilets of today, the thread of ritual continues, and perhaps most telling of all is the persistence of belief. In modern Japan, some still place charms or talismans in their bathrooms, echoing the old idea of toilet deities. Children are told gentle versions of old folklore, warnings that remind them to treat the bathroom with care. In daily language, euphemisms soften the subject, turning something base into something polite. So when you imagine Japanese toileting through history, think not of something crude or hidden away. Think of ritual paths through gardens, gods watching from shadows, the careful collection of waste as nourishment for rice fields, the poems written about trickling water. Think of toilets as spaces where practicality and spirituality were never far apart. It is remarkable, is it not, that in Japan even this most ordinary human act became an art of living, structured, respected, and at times even sacred. When we picture the Middle Ages, we often imagine castles, knights, bustling markets, and cathedrals rising over towns. Yet for the vast majority of people, peasants, labourers, and villagers, daily life was not shaped by pageantry, but by the rhythms of the household, the land, and the body. Among those rhythms was the quiet, often overlooked matter of waste. Toileting in the medieval village was not a matter of luxury or technology, but of simple survival, modest solutions, and the humble chamber pot. In the countryside, where most Europeans lived, houses were small, dark, and simple. Built of wattle and daub, thatched roofs and packed earth floors, these cottages rarely had specialized rooms. Sleeping, eating, cooking, and storage all happened in a single space. There were no bathrooms in the modern sense. When nature called, villagers relied on chamber pots, sturdy vessels made of wood, ceramic, or metal. These were kept close at hand, often under the bed or by the hearth. In the cold nights of winter, when stepping outside meant braving frost or mud, the chamber pot was indispensable. The chamber pot was both practical and intimate. Everyone in the household, from children to elders, shared it. Privacy was limited, and modesty took on a different meaning than today. To relieve oneself indoors was not shameful, but ordinary. The pot was used, emptied, rinsed, and set back in its place. Emptied where exactly? That depended on the village. In some households, the contents of the chamber pot were carried outside to a midden heap, a general dumping ground for food scraps, ashes, and refuse. In other cases, waste was thrown into ditches or onto fields, where it decomposed and returned to the soil. This recycling was pragmatic. Manure from animals and waste from humans alike could enrich the land. Farmers knew the value of such matter, and in a subsistence economy, little went to waste. But this practice had its drawbacks. Villages were not designed with sanitation in mind. Narrow lanes, open drains, and muddy yards quickly became foul if waste was not managed carefully. Rain carried refuse into common wells or streams, spreading illness. Outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and other diseases were common, though villagers had little understanding of germs. Instead, they framed such misfortunes through religion or folklore, seeing them as punishments, curses, or tests of faith. Despite these hazards, life went on. Chamber pots were cleaned daily, often with water fetched from a stream. In wealthier homes, ashes from the hearth were sprinkled inside to absorb odors. Some pots were plain, while others were decorated with simple designs, showing that even objects of necessity could reflect a touch of craftsmanship. Archaeologists frequently find these pots in fragments, their broken pieces buried in old rubbish pits, silent witnesses to the routines of countless families. For villagers, the rhythm of toileting was tied to the rhythms of work. Men and women rose at dawn, worked the fields, tended animals, and returned to their homes at dusk. Chamber pots, discreet and functional, allowed life to continue without interruption. At night, the pot saved a dangerous trip outdoors. In a time before lamps were common, stepping into the dark carried risks, wild animals, thieves, or simply stumbling in the mud. The chamber pot, humble though it was, offered safety. Life in medieval villages was communal, and this extended to matters of waste. In some places, shared latrines existed. simple pits or outhouses near fields or at the edge of the village. These were little more than holes in the ground covered by wooden planks. They served entire families or even neighborhoods, a collective solution to an unavoidable need. While not pleasant, they reflected the cooperative spirit of village survival. Children grew up accustomed to chamber pots and outhouses. Training was practical, not ceremonial. Parents instructed children early to use the pot or to accompany them outside. In households with infants, swaddling often complicated matters, so waste was managed by frequent cleaning rather than by designated facilities. Life was messier than modern standards allow, yet villagers developed resilience and adaptation. The church, so central to medieval life, also shaped attitudes toward waste. Monasteries had stricter systems. Cloisters often contained latrines that ran over streams, carrying waste away. These monastic designs were far more advanced than village practices, but they highlighted a principle that villagers could observe. Cleanliness had spiritual meaning. Though peasants did not have the resources of monks, they shared the belief that cleanliness, however modest, was linked to piety. Chamber pots, though ordinary, were washed with care, as if to maintain dignity even in humble surroundings. Festivities and fairs revealed another side of village toileting. When people gathered in large numbers, temporary solutions were needed. Pits were dug, straw was spread, and wooden screens provided minimal privacy. After the gatherings ended, these pits were covered, returning waste to the soil. It was an early version of crowd management, practical and temporary, woven into the seasonal calendar of village life. Smells were inescapable in medieval villages. Animals lived close to humans, refuse accumulated, and chamber pots, even when emptied, contributed to the odor of daily life. Yet villagers were accustomed to it. The sharp sense of waste mingled with smoke from hearths, the tang of manure, the fragrance of herbs hung to dry, and the aroma of cooking stews. It was a sensory world, very different from our own, but to medieval noses it was simply home. Despite hardship, humor was never far away. Medieval culture often treated bodily functions with earthy laughter. Folktales and songs sometimes mentioned chamber pots in jest, poking fun at accidents or mishaps. The pot, both necessary and ever-present, became a symbol of common humanity. Everyone needed it, from the lord in his hall to the peasant in his hut, though the vessels themselves might differ in material and decoration. The role of women in maintaining these practices was crucial. Women were often responsible for emptying and cleaning chamber pots, ensuring that the household remained functional. This task, though unglamorous, was a quiet pillar of daily life. Men too contributed, especially in farming contexts where waste was valuable for crops. But the everyday management of household pots largely fell to women. Their labor kept families healthy and homes livable. Over time, as villages grew into towns, chamber pots remained central, but were increasingly supplemented by cesspits. These deeper, lined holes could contain more waste and reduce surface pollution. In smaller villages, though, the old routines persisted for centuries. Chamber pots were too convenient to abandon, too adaptable to be replaced. Even as towns experimented with municipal latrines or rudimentary sewers, villagers clung to the pot beneath the bed. The medieval chamber pot may seem crude by today's standards, but it carried a quiet dignity. It was crafted by local potters, used by entire families, and integrated into the cycles of work, sleep, and survival. It embodied the resilience of people who, with limited means, found ways to manage the necessities of life. In the end, the story of medieval village life is incomplete without acknowledging the chamber pot. It was an uncelebrated but essential companion, bridging the divide between body and soil, between private need and communal survival. Where castles boasted stone latrines and monasteries engineered water channels, The village relied on this hub, and in its unassuming presence it shaped the rhythm of medieval life, quietly, persistently, without fanfare. When we think of those villages now, with their smoke rising from thatched roofs, and their fields stretching into the horizon, it is worth remembering the simple chamber pot beneath the bed. A small, sturdy object that carried the weight of daily necessity. It connected generations to the land, to each other, and to the unchanging realities of human life. Paris, the city so often romanticized today as the capital of beauty and light, once carried a very different reputation. Long before it became a center of elegance, Paris was notorious for its foul smells. In the medieval and early modern eras, the streets overflowed with refuse, the Seine doubled as a dumping ground, and the very air seemed saturated with decay. The tale of Paris's sanitation is not just about filth. It is a story of gradual struggle, innovation, and the shaping of a modern city. Life in the crowded neighborhoods of medieval Paris was intimate, busy, and unsanitary. Narrow lanes twisted between timber-framed houses, some so close together that neighbors could shake hands from opposite windows. Beneath these homes, waste gathered quickly. There were few organized systems to carry it away. Chamber pots were emptied directly onto streets, and shopkeepers tossed scraps outside their doors. The mixture of human waste, animal dung, and food remains created a constant stench. Rain washed it into gutters and down toward the river, but this solved little. The Seine was already polluted with the city's refuse. By day, Parisians tried to ignore the odors, masking them with strong perfumes, herbs, or burning incense. By night, scavengers and cleaners, the rakers, trudged through, hauling carts of filth out of the busiest squares. Their job was dangerous and despised, but essential. Without their efforts, the city would have drowned in its own waste. Cesspits, dug beneath houses or in courtyards, were another common solution. They filled slowly but surely. When they overflowed, residents called upon workers known as fosseurs, men skilled at emptying these pits. The task was grim. Armed with buckets and ropes, they descended into the dark, noxious holes and hauled waste to the surface. The smell was unbearable, and the risk of sickness or collapse constant. Yet the fosseurs were indispensable figures in keeping Paris habitable. Despite these rudimentary efforts, filth remained a daily reality. In summer, heat made the smells unbearable. Flies swarmed over piles of refuse. Wells and fountains, meant to provide drinking water, were often contaminated. Outbreaks of dysentery and plague spread swiftly. Ordinary Parisians, lacking any concept of germs, blamed the foul air, what they called miasma. To them, disease floated invisibly in the stench itself. Authorities were not blind to the problem. From time to time, royal edicts forbade throwing waste into the streets, demanding instead that people use pits or designated dumps. But enforcement was weak, and habit was stronger. People valued convenience over regulation. Even nobles and wealthy merchants who lived in finer homes contributed to the problem, allowing their servants to toss refuse out windows. By the 17th century, the foulness of Paris had become infamous. Foreign visitors often remarked on the stench. Some compared the Seine to an open sewer. Writers described the streets as rivers of mud and filth. Yet even amid this reality, the city grew. More people crowded into neighborhoods, more waste accumulated, and the challenge of managing it became even greater. The first stirrings of change came slowly. Engineers and officials began to experiment with covered drains and channels. These were primitive by modern standards, but they hinted at what was possible. By the 18th century, sections of Paris had underground sewers, stone tunnels that carried waste and rainwater away from the streets. At first, only a small portion of the city benefited, but it was a beginning. Still, much of Paris remained dirty. Chamber pots continued to be emptied out of windows, sometimes striking unlucky passers-by. To warn those below, people shouted, "Gardez l'eau," literally, "Watch out for the water." This cry became part of daily life, a grim reminder that the streets belonged as much to waste as to people. The French Revolution brought upheaval and with it, debates about public health. Revolutionary leaders saw the connection between filth and misery. A cleaner Paris, they argued, was not just a matter of comfort, but of equality. Citizens deserved dignity, and proper sanitation was part of that. Plans were drawn up to expand sewer networks and improve waste collection. Yet resources were scarce and progress was slow. It was in the 19th century, under the rule of Napoleon III and his prefect Baron Haussmann, that Paris truly transformed. Haussmann's famous renovation of the city is remembered for wide boulevards and grand parks, but beneath the surface, another revolution unfolded: the sewers. Engineers designed a comprehensive underground network to carry waste and rainwater away efficiently. Massive stone tunnels were dug beneath the boulevards, lined with brick and carefully graded to allow flow. For the first time, Paris had a modern sanitation system. These new sewers were marvels of engineering, wide enough for men to walk through, ventilated to reduce odors, and connected to nearly every street. They changed the experience of urban life. Waste no longer lingered underfoot. Streets grew cleaner, water supplies safer, and disease outbreaks less severe. Parisians, long accustomed to stench, began to imagine a city that smelled fresher, where the air itself seemed healthier. Public fascination with the sewers grew, tours were offered, and writers celebrated the underground labyrinth. Victor Hugo, in Les Misérables, described them as the intestines of Paris, a hidden world beneath the glamorous boulevards. They became symbols of progress, proof that science and engineering could conquer filth. Even so, challenges remained. Not all neighborhoods were connected immediately, and many poor districts still struggled with overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. Yet, the direction was clear. The Paris of overflowing pits and open refuse heaps was fading, replaced by a new urban order where sanitation was part of civic pride. The smelly revolution of Paris is not just a tale of pipes and stonework. It reveals the slow but profound shift in how people thought about waste. What had once been tolerated as unavoidable became seen as unacceptable. Cleanliness was redefined not as luxury but as necessity. Public health became a duty of the state, and sewers, once invisible, became monuments to progress. When we walk the bright streets of Paris today, lined with cafes and gardens, it is easy to forget that beneath our feet lies a vast network of tunnels, carrying away what once defined the city's reputation for stench. The sewers, though rarely celebrated, were as transformative as the boulevards above them. They turned Paris from a city of odors into a city of light. The Industrial Revolution changed almost every aspect of human life: work, travel, health, and the very structure of cities. But hidden in the steam and smoke of this new age was another transformation, one that most people did not speak about openly, yet felt every single day: the rise of public toilets. Before the 19th century, most urban dwellers had little access to anything resembling a communal bathroom. In villages or small towns, people still relied on chamber pots, cesspits, or fields outside the settlement. In growing industrial cities, where populations multiplied at dizzying speed, these old methods collapsed under the sheer weight of numbers. Streets filled with waste, the air stank, rivers and canals became open sewers, and as more people crowded into factories, offices and railways, the absence of shared facilities became impossible to ignore. In London, Manchester and Birmingham, cities at the heart of Britain's industrial boom, the sanitation crisis reached alarming proportions. Workers who spent 12 or more hours a day in textile mills or metal workshops had no private spaces for relief. Some slipped out into alleys or courtyards, while others waited miserably until they returned home. For women, the situation was even more restrictive. Social expectations combined with the lack of facilities meant that many simply endured discomfort for hours. This problem was so widespread it even had a name, the urinary leash, describing how far women could move about a city without needing relief. The absence of toilets was more than an inconvenience. It was a public health catastrophe. Human waste in streets and waterways spread diseases like cholera and typhoid. Cholera, in particular, haunted 19th century cities. Outbreaks struck London, Paris, Hamburg, and many other centres of industry, killing thousands within weeks. At first, medical authorities clung to the theory of miasma, the belief that bad smells cause disease. Even though they did not yet understand germs, they recognized that filth and illness traveled together. And so reformers began to demand change. One of the most significant turning points came with the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London. This event was meant to showcase the marvels of modern invention. Among the glass and iron of the Crystal Palace, visitors encountered something far more practical: public flush toilets. Designed by engineer George Jennings, these public conveniences featured water closets that visitors could use for a small fee. Over 800,000 people tried them during the exhibition. For many, it was their first experience of a flush toilet outside the home. The idea caught on instantly. From then on, the phrase "spend a penny" became a polite euphemism for using the toilet, since that was the charge for entry. Soon, cities across Britain began installing permanent public conveniences. They appeared in parks, markets, railway stations, and busy streets. Many were built underground, with elegant cast-iron railings and staircases leading down. Inside, tiled walls, brass fixtures, and attendants ensured that they were not only functional, but also respectable. To use them was to step into a clean, orderly space, an escape from the grime of the industrial city. The movement spread across Europe and beyond. In Paris, public urinals known as Vespasiennes were installed along boulevards and squares. These cylindrical structures offered privacy to men while also addressing the endless problem of public urination. In Berlin, Vienna, and Amsterdam, similar facilities appeared, often built with ornate ironwork that made them blend into the urban landscape. Yet access remained uneven. For decades, most public toilets were designed primarily for men. Women's needs were largely ignored, partly because of cost and partly because of lingering social taboos. A man could slip into a street urinal without much comment, but women entering a public facility was treated as improper or unnecessary. Campaigners, especially women's groups, began to argue for better provision. Their efforts slowly bore fruit toward the end of the 19th century, when ladies' conveniences were finally constructed in major cities. Even then, they were fewer and often harder to find. The link between sanitation and public health became clearer with time. In London, reformer Edwin Chadwick published a landmark report in 1842, The Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population. He argued that filth and disease were directly tied, and that governments had a responsibility to provide clean water and proper waste disposal. His ideas helped spark a wave of sanitary reform, leading to improved sewer systems and more public conveniences. The industrial workplace also adapted. Factories and offices began installing shared facilities for workers, though often in cramped or unsanitary forms at first. Over time, employers recognized that healthier workers were more productive, and better washrooms became part of modern industrial design. Railways and ships, which moved thousands of people daily, also added public toilets, acknowledging that mass transport required mass sanitation. Public toilets, in their way, reshaped how people experienced the city. Suddenly, it was possible to spend an entire day in town, shopping, socializing, or working, without the constant anxiety of needing relief. Parks and promenades became more welcoming. Women, in particular, gained greater mobility once they had access to facilities. Though the inequality in provision remained, the very presence of public toilets began to challenge the old restrictions of the urinary leash. Not everyone welcomed these changes without hesitation. Some people viewed public conveniences as indecent, fearing they might encourage immoral behavior. Others balked at the idea of paying for something so basic. And yet the momentum was unstoppable. Once introduced, the benefits were too obvious to ignore. By the late 19th century, the public toilet had become a symbol of modern urban life. It represented hygiene, order, and the reach of civic responsibility. Just as paved streets and gas lights signaled progress, so too did clean, accessible conveniences. They were reminders that the city could be more than just a place of toil and filth. It could also be livable, dignified, and humane. The Industrial Revolution, remembered for its smokestacks and machines, also produced this quieter revolution. It forced societies to confront the practical needs of crowded populations, and in doing so, it redefined the relationship between people, waste, and public space. Toilets may have been hidden away in basements or behind iron screens, but they became cornerstones of the modern city. And as strange as it may seem, the history of public toilets during this era reflects the broader changes of the time. They show how necessity and innovation combine to reshape everyday life. They reveal the ways in which health, dignity, and urban planning became linked. And they remind us that even amid the grand inventions of steam engines and railroads, something as ordinary as a clean toilet could transform how people lived, worked, and moved through the world. If the Industrial Revolution provided the foundations for public toilets, the Victorian era layered them with rules, rituals, and a culture of etiquette. The Victorians were deeply concerned with appearances, morality, and cleanliness, and nowhere did these values collide more clearly than in matters of hygiene. Toilets, baths, and washing were no longer simply practical concerns. They became symbols of respectability and order. In the first half of the 19th century, Britain's growing cities struggled under the weight of poor sanitation. The stench of open drains, overflowing cesspools, and polluted rivers was inescapable. For the middle and upper classes, this filth threatened not just health but also propriety. A respectable household was expected to be clean, organized, and above all, morally upright. Dirt, both physical and metaphorical, was something to be banished. One of the most influential voices of the age was Edwin Chadwick, whose sanitary reforms tied cleanliness to public morality. His arguments helped inspire the creation of vast sewer systems, most famously Joseph Bazalgette's network beneath London, which carried waste away from the city and dramatically reduced outbreaks of disease. Yet beyond these grand engineering feats, change also filtered into the domestic sphere. Toilets, once tucked away in outhouses or hidden corners, began to move indoors. The water closet, perfected in the late 18th century, became a hallmark of the Victorian home. Early adopters were the wealthy, who could afford the plumbing and space. By mid-century, fashionable houses boasted separate lavatories, often adorned with decorative tiles, polished wood seats, and porcelain bowls. These were not crude facilities, but carefully designed spaces, signaling refinement and modernity. For middle-class families aspiring to social respectability, installing a water closet was almost as important as owning fine china or proper furniture. With indoor toilets came a whole culture of etiquette. Manuals of household management instructed readers on how to maintain these new conveniences. They were to be kept spotless, aired frequently, and treated with discretion. Guests should never be inconvenienced by odors or visible uncleanliness. Servants were often tasked with ensuring that chamber pots and closets were emptied and scrubbed without drawing attention to their work. Silence and invisibility surrounded the subject. To speak openly about such matters was considered vulgar. This silence extended into public life as well. Public conveniences were appearing in cities, but they were designed with great care to maintain modesty. Men's facilities might be somewhat utilitarian, but women's were tucked discreetly into basements or behind screened entrances. Architectural journals of the time debated the best designs for ventilation, privacy, and respectability. Even signage was often coded, avoiding blunt references. The Victorian obsession with etiquette extended beyond the toilet itself to broader ideas of bodily management. Regular bathing became increasingly fashionable, supported by the spread of indoor plumbing. Soap advertisements flourished, linking cleanliness with beauty, health, and moral worth. Campaigns urged the poor to wash more frequently, presenting it as both a civic duty and a path toward respectability. Clean skin, clean clothing, and clean homes all became markers of moral character. For women in particular, hygiene and etiquette were tightly bound. A respectable lady was expected to embody purity and refinement. To be seen entering a public convenience could invite whispers, as it suggested too direct an acknowledgement of bodily needs. Campaigners for women's public toilets had to frame their arguments carefully, emphasizing not comfort, but necessity. Without such facilities, women could not participate fully in civic life, from shopping to working outside the home. This debate reflected the larger struggle for women's independence in Victorian society. Etiquette even reached into the language used around toilets. Euphemisms flourished: powder room, lavatory, retiring room. Direct references were avoided in polite company. The act of excusing oneself was wrapped in phrases designed to smooth over any mention of bodily functions. These verbal rituals reveal how deeply the Victorians wished to keep the subject hidden, even as toilets themselves became more visible parts of everyday life. In wealthier households, bathrooms and lavatories were often treated as showcases of taste. The Victorians embraced ornate design, and even a humble toilet could become an object of craftsmanship. Porcelain bowls featured floral patterns, wooden seats were carved or polished, and flush handles gleamed with brass or silver. Catalogues displayed these fixtures alongside bathtubs and sinks, turning the necessities of hygiene into consumer goods that reflected one's social standing. At the same time, public authorities wrestled with balancing utility and dignity. Underground conveniences in London, with their tiled walls and brass fittings, were often staffed by attendants who kept them clean and orderly. The attendants themselves played a social role, enforcing norms of proper use and ensuring that the spaces maintained an air of respectability. For a penny, a user entered not just a restroom, but a carefully managed social environment. The emphasis on etiquette also revealed contradictions. While Victorians celebrated cleanliness, vast sections of the working class lived in conditions that made regular bathing or indoor toilets impossible. Crowded tenements shared a few outdoor privies, often foul and poorly maintained. Reformers campaigned for improvements, arguing that sanitary provision was not just a luxury, but a necessity for public health. Slowly, through municipal initiatives, washhouses and public baths were introduced, offering access to cleanliness for those who could not afford private facilities. Interestingly, the Victorian toilet also became entangled with scientific curiosity. Advances in plumbing and sewage treatment fascinated engineers and reformers. Exhibitions displayed the latest flush mechanisms, traps and pipes. The perfection of the S-bend, which used a water seal to block odours from rising into the home, was celebrated as a triumph of design. Cleanliness was not only moral but technological, a sign that progress and science were taming the most unpleasant aspects of urban life. Even literature and humour of the period reflected these tensions. Comic sketches sometimes poked fun at the elaborate euphemisms surrounding bodily needs, while moralists warned against frivolity in matters of hygiene. The toilet, though rarely discussed outright, hovered on the edge of polite society, shaping behaviour in ways both obvious and subtle. By the close of the 19th century, Victorian attitudes toward hygiene had left a lasting mark. toilets had moved indoors, tied to ideals of refinement and privacy. Public conveniences had become standard features of modern cities, though access remained uneven. Etiquette had woven an invisible web around daily habits, dictating not only where and how people relieved themselves, but also how they spoke, or avoided speaking, about it. The Victorian era, remembered for its prudishness and moral codes, reveals much about the social meaning of sanitation. Toilets were not just tools for health, they were stages upon which the dramas of class, gender, and respectability played out. Cleanliness was virtue, silence was propriety, and plumbing was progress. In this way, the Victorian obsession with hygiene and etiquette transformed the toilet into more than a convenience. It became a mirror of society's deepest anxieties and aspirations, a private act wrapped in public values, a necessity cloaked in ceremony, a daily ritual that told a larger story about who the Victorians believed themselves to be. As the 20th century unfolded, toilets and plumbing entered a new phase of transformation. The experiments of the Victorian era had established sanitation as a public good and a symbol of refinement, but it was the modern age that brought consistency, comfort, and near-universal access. What had once been luxuries of the wealthy became everyday expectations, shaping not only homes, but entire cities. At the dawn of the century, flush toilets were still spreading unevenly. In wealthier neighborhoods, homes had indoor plumbing with porcelain bowls, polished seats, and separate bathrooms. But in poorer districts, many still relied on shared privies or outdoor latrines. Municipal governments, however, were determined to modernize. With the rise of urban planning, sanitation was seen as inseparable from housing, water supply, and health. Local councils passed ordinances requiring indoor toilets in new homes, gradually phasing out outdoor facilities. The technology itself was improving rapidly. The S-bend, perfected in the 19th century, became a standard feature, ensuring that unpleasant odors stayed sealed away. Flush handles and levers were refined for reliability. Manufacturers experimented with water-saving mechanisms, though early models often used generous amounts of water. Porcelain production advanced as well, allowing for bowls that were not only functional, but smooth, durable, and easy to clean. By the 1920s, catalogues offered a variety of models at different price points, turning the toilet into a consumer good for mass markets. One of the most significant changes of the 20th century was the gradual standardization of bathrooms. Instead of scattered washstands, chamber pots, or improvised arrangements, the modern home increasingly featured a single, integrated space, a bathroom containing a toilet, sink, and tub or shower. This new arrangement reflected efficiency and privacy. Families no longer treated the toilet as a hidden corner, but as part of the everyday domestic landscape. Plumbing networks tied the bathroom to the broader city, linking private comfort with public infrastructure. Public authorities continued to expand systems of sewers and treatment plants. Cities across Europe and North America invested in modern facilities that not only carried waste away but also processed it to reduce pollution. This marked a turning point. Toilets were no longer just ways of getting rid of waste, but gateways into vast municipal systems designed to protect rivers, lakes, and water supplies. The toilet became part of an invisible machine of urban health. The two world wars accelerated innovation in unexpected ways. In the trenches of the First World War, sanitation remained primitive and often dire, but engineers and medics studied the problem intensely. Their work influenced peacetime plumbing, emphasizing durability and efficiency. During the Second World War, military camps and naval ships required reliable toilets that could function under pressure and in confined spaces. These designs inspired improvements in compactness, flushing mechanisms, and hygiene standards, later adopted in civilian life. By the mid-20th century, indoor flush toilets were becoming universal in developed nations. Governments launched housing programs after the Second World War, ensuring that even working-class families gained access to modern bathrooms. In Britain, council housing often included up-to-date plumbing. In the United States, suburban developments built after the war treated flush toilets as basic amenities. Advertisements in magazines portrayed sparkling white bathrooms as symbols of domestic happiness, often featuring smiling families and gleaming fixtures. Cleanliness was no longer just a moral ideal, it was a modern lifestyle. Toilets also reflected the cultural shifts of the century. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Art Deco movement brought bold lines and geometric patterns into bathrooms. In the 1950s and 1960s, pastel-colored fixtures, pink, turquoise, avocado green, turned toilets into design statements. Manufacturers marketed coordinated suites, encouraging homeowners to match their toilets with sinks, bathtubs and tiles. The bathroom became not just a functional space, but an arena of personal expression, reflecting taste and prosperity. The late 20th century saw increasing attention to water use. As concerns about conservation grew, regulators and engineers worked to make toilets more efficient. In the United States, the 1992 Energy Policy Act required new toilets to use no more than 1.6 gallons per flush. Early low-flush models faced criticism for being ineffective, but design improvements soon made them reliable. Dual flush systems, pioneered in Australia, offered users the option of a lighter flush for liquid waste, dramatically reducing household water consumption. Technology also crept into the bathroom in more surprising ways. In Japan, especially from the 1980s onward, advanced toilets gained international attention. Companies such as Toto developed units with heated seats, built-in bidets, warm air dryers, and even music to mask sound. These washlet toilets represented a fusion of comfort, hygiene, and innovation. For many visitors, they became memorable symbols of Japan's embrace of futuristic convenience. Accessibility was another key theme of the 20th century. Campaigners argued that public restrooms should serve all people, including those with disabilities. In the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 mandated accessible facilities, leading to the widespread installation of grab bars, wider stalls, and lowered sinks. This shift reflected a growing recognition that sanitation was not just a private matter, but a public right tied to dignity and equality. Meanwhile, debates about gender and toilets continued. Women had long demanded better access to public facilities, and by the mid-20th century, women's restrooms became more common in workplaces, schools, and shopping centers. Yet, disparities remained. Queues for women's toilets were often far longer than for men's, sparking campaigns for potty parity. Architects and planners grappled with how to balance space, privacy, and fairness in restroom design. By the end of the century, toilets had achieved something extraordinary, near invisibility. In much of the developed world, people no longer thought about their toilets except when they malfunctioned. Flush, wash, move on. The process was smooth and reliable. Yet beneath this simplicity lay vast networks of pipes, treatment plants, and engineering marvels, the product of a century of innovation. Even so, global inequality persisted. While developed nations perfected porcelain and plumbing, billions of people in other regions still lacked access to basic sanitation. International organizations such as the World Health Organization and UNICEF highlighted this disparity, framing it as one of the great public health challenges of the modern era. Thus, the story of 20th century toilets was not one of universal triumph, but of uneven progress, with advanced innovations existing alongside ongoing struggles for basic hygiene. In sum, the 20th century transformed toilets from luxuries of the privileged into everyday necessities. Plumbing systems matured, flush technology standardized, and bathrooms became integral to the architecture of homes and cities. Toilets became both consumer goods and public utilities, blending private comfort with civic responsibility. Innovations range from pastel colors to high-tech bidets, from efficient flushes to universal access. More than any previous century, the 20th cemented the toilet as an essential part of modern life, reliable, ubiquitous, and deeply woven into the fabric of daily existence. The porcelain bowl, humble yet revolutionary, stood as a quiet testament to progress, technology, and the ongoing pursuit of dignity in even the most private of human rituals. War has always been a testing ground for human endurance, and sanitation often became one of the least glamorous but most crucial challenges of survival. Toilets in wartime were not about comfort or refinement, but about necessity, disease control, and sheer practicality under extreme conditions. From the mud of the First World War trenches to sprawling refugee camps of the 20th century, the story of toilets in war reflects how societies confronted chaos while trying to preserve human dignity. The trench systems of the Western Front symbolized stagnation and suffering. Soldiers lived for weeks, even months, in deep channels cut into wet ground. Sanitation quickly became one of the greatest difficulties. Early in the war, makeshift holes, known as trench latrines, were dug, sometimes covered with wooden planks to provide minimal seating. These pits filled rapidly, and in the damp environment, they became breeding grounds for flies, lice, and disease. To manage the problem, engineers developed more systematic solutions. Bucket latrines were introduced, wooden boxes or barrels placed within dugouts. When full, these had to be carried by sanitation details, often under fire, to be emptied into larger pits farther behind the lines. The task was despised but essential. Soldiers knew that poor waste management could cause outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, or cholera, illnesses that had devastated armies in earlier conflicts. Commanders recognized sanitation as a matter of military efficiency. If an army was crippled by disease, it could not fight. Therefore, units dedicated to hygiene and engineering were formed, responsible for digging new latrines, burning waste, and ensuring that the trenches, however miserable, did not collapse into pestilence. Even so, the stench was overwhelming, and many memoirs of trench life recall the constant smell of rot and human waste mixing with mud and death. By the Second World War, armies had learned hard lessons. Trench warfare gave way to more mobile strategies, but the problem of sanitation remained urgent. Military planners incorporated field latrines into manuals and supply lists. Portable solutions were developed, including collapsible seats with containers beneath them. On long marches or temporary bivouacs, soldiers dug straddle trenches, shallow slots where men squatted side by side before filling the holes back in with soil. In more permanent encampments, waste disposal became organized. Large pits were dug and treated with lime to reduce smell and disease. Some camps built latrine huts with rows of seats over running troughs of water, which carried waste away. Engineers also constructed incinerators to burn solid waste, particularly in tropical theaters where flies were relentless carriers of disease. Naval vessels faced different challenges. Submarines and warships had confined spaces and long voyages, demanding toilets that worked under pressure and in motion. Early submarine toilets were notoriously complicated, requiring multiple valves to be opened in sequence. A mistake could flood the compartment with seawater, or worse. Many sailors joked that the toilets were more dangerous than enemy torpedoes. Over time, engineers refined the designs, but the memory of malfunctioning submarine toilets lingered as a symbol of wartime inconvenience. In prisoner of war camps, sanitation became a matter of survival and control. Overcrowding meant that latrines were often inadequate, with prisoners forced to line up for hours or use overflowing pits. In some camps, buckets served entire barracks, emptied only sporadically. Poor hygiene contributed to outbreaks of dysentery and other intestinal diseases, weakening prisoners already suffering from malnutrition. For many, the lack of sanitation was as dehumanizing as hunger or forced labor. It may seem surprising, but toilets played a direct role in military strategy. Armies that maintained good sanitation kept their troops healthier and more effective. During the North African campaigns, Allied commanders ordered strict rules for waste disposal in the desert, where flies could spread disease rapidly. Soldiers were required to cover waste immediately, sometimes with burning fuel, to prevent infestation. In the Pacific, the US Army distributed manuals explaining how to dig proper latrines in jungle soil, ensuring they were far enough from water sources to avoid contamination. The enemy could also weaponize sanitation. Contaminating wells or sabotaging latrines were ways to weaken opposing forces. Though outright biological warfare was rare, the fear of it meant that armies carefully guarded their water supplies and latrine areas. Protecting soldiers from invisible threats became as important as shielding them from bullets. Wartime sanitation extended far beyond the battlefield. Civilians displaced by conflict often found themselves in vast camps with limited facilities. The 20th century saw mass movements of people during and after wars. Refugees from Europe in the 1940s, displaced communities in Asia, and countless others fleeing violence. In these camps, toilets, or their absence, were critical. Humanitarian agencies built rows of pit latrines, sometimes covered with simple shelters, to serve thousands of people. The placement of toilets had to balance hygiene with safety. For women and children, using latrines at night could be dangerous, so organizations installed lighting or arranged for community watch systems. Despite these efforts, overcrowding often overwhelmed facilities, leading to outbreaks of cholera or other waterborne diseases. Here, too, toilets became a measure of dignity. Access to a private, or at least clean latrine, helped people retain a sense of normal life amid upheaval. Aid workers recognized that sanitation was not just a technical matter, but a social one, affecting morale, safety, and human rights. In wartime, the toilet symbolized a fragile boundary between humanity and chaos. Soldiers joked crudely about their latrines, but those jokes masked fear and disgust. Having a place, even a crude one, to relieve oneself provided a small sense of order. Conversely, being denied that space could be deeply humiliating. In prisoner of war camps, forcing inmates to use overflowing buckets was a deliberate method of breaking spirits. Military engineers thus carried a hidden responsibility to build and maintain toilets that kept disease at bay and morale intact. Their work rarely featured in heroic stories, but without it, armies would have faltered. In many memoirs, veterans recall the relief of finding a decent latrine after weeks of squalor, a reminder that even in war, small comforts mattered. The sanitation lessons of wartime did not disappear when peace returned. Engineers who designed field latrines brought their knowledge back into civilian life. The emphasis on durability, portability, and disease prevention influenced post-war disaster relief and refugee aid. The very idea of emergency sanitation, building toilets quickly in difficult environments, was refined through military necessity. Moreover, wars exposed the global inequality of sanitation. Soldiers from industrialized nations who had grown used to flush toilets suddenly encountered primitive conditions abroad. For many, it was a jarring reminder that modern plumbing was not universal. Aid organizations, born in part from wartime experiences, later carried forward missions to improve sanitation worldwide. From the trenches of the First World War to the sprawling camps of displaced civilians, toilets in wartime revealed the constant struggle to balance survival with dignity. They were crude, improvised, often miserable, yet utterly essential. Wars forced humanity to confront waste under the harshest conditions, reminding us that even amid conflict, the most basic needs could not be ignored. Toilets became silent participants in battle, guardians against disease, symbols of endurance, and fragile markers of civilization in the midst of destruction. If history has shown us one thing, it is that toilets are never just about convenience. They are windows into culture, technology, and survival. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the realm of modern innovations, and especially in space, where gravity itself refuses to cooperate. From orbiting astronauts to futuristic experimental designs, toilets today continue to challenge our ingenuity and reflect our most basic yet universal needs. On Earth, toilets rely on gravity. Waste falls down, water flushes it away, and pipes carry it elsewhere. In space, none of this works. Without gravity, liquids and solids float, threatening to spread bacteria and contaminate delicate equipment. Engineers working for NASA, Roscosmos, and other space agencies had to rethink the very fundamentals of sanitation. The earliest American astronauts did not have toilets at all. During Project Mercury in the early 1960s, flights were short, so astronauts used urine collection bags taped to their bodies. For defecation, the solution was even more primitive: plastic bags sealed with adhesive. These were clumsy, uncomfortable, and notoriously messy if the seal failed. Astronauts joked about them, but the reality was humiliating. By the Apollo program, engineers had slightly improved matters. Urine collection devices were attached to hoses that drained into storage containers. For solid waste, astronauts still used bags, but with more structured systems for sealing and storing them. The Apollo missions to the Moon made it clear that something better was needed, especially for longer missions. When the space shuttle began flying in the 1980s, it carried a new kind of toilet. Instead of relying on gravity, the shuttle toilet used airflow. Fans created suction, drawing waste into collection containers. For urination, astronauts attached hoses with male or female adapters. For defecation, there was a seat, though much smaller than on Earth, fitted with restraints to keep the astronaut from floating away mid-use. Training to use the shuttle toilet was surprisingly serious. Astronauts practiced in mock-ups on the ground, using video cameras to ensure correct alignment. Even with training, using the toilet in microgravity required patience and skill. Waste was stored in sealed containers until the shuttle returned to Earth, where it was disposed of. The shuttle toilet, though far from luxurious, represented a breakthrough. It allowed astronauts to live in orbit for weeks or months without the daily ordeal of waste bags. More importantly, it proved that with clever engineering, even the absence of gravity could be managed. The International Space Station, ISS, continuously occupied since 2000, demanded an even more advanced approach. Crews from many countries needed reliable toilets for years on end. Two main systems were used, one developed by Russia, the other by the United States. Both relied on airflow, but the Russian design was often praised for its durability. Waste was directed into sealed containers, while urine was funneled into hoses. A key innovation came with water recycling. On the ISS, urine is filtered and purified back into drinking water. Though unappealing to imagine, astronauts know that every drop of water is precious. The recycling system is so efficient that NASA proudly says today's coffee may be yesterday's urine. For solid waste, sealed bags are stored in containers until they can be loaded onto supply ships. These ships, once filled with trash and waste, are released to burn up in Earth's atmosphere, ensuring nothing lingers in orbit. In 2020, NASA introduced a new $23 million toilet, officially called the Universal Waste Management System. Lighter, smaller, and designed for both male and female astronauts, it prepares for future missions to the Moon and Mars. Engineers even considered posture and comfort, making the design more user-friendly. The existence of space toilets might sound humorous, but they carry deep significance. They symbolize human adaptability. If we are to become a spacefaring species, we cannot avoid basic biology. Every long journey to the Moon, to Mars, or beyond will depend not just on rockets and habitats, but also on working toilets. Astronauts themselves often acknowledge this. They say that mastering sanitation in orbit was one of the greatest engineering feats of space travel. While rockets capture public imagination, the humble toilet ensures survival. Without it, missions would be short, miserable, and dangerous. While space demanded radical reinvention, toilets on Earth also entered the modern age. Japan, in particular, became famous for turning toilets into technological marvels. The washlet, pioneered in the 1980s, added features like heated seats, built-in bidets, warm air dryers, and even music to mask sounds. These toilets became cultural icons, blending hygiene with comfort and luxury. Other innovations followed. Smart toilets appeared, capable of analyzing urine for signs of illness, connecting to apps, and adjusting settings automatically for each user. In some public restrooms, sensors replaced flush handles entirely, ensuring that no surface needed touching. Sustainability also became a focus, with water-saving dual flush systems spreading worldwide. In countries with water shortages, composting toilets gained attention. These systems separate liquids from solids and use controlled decomposition to turn waste into safe compost. Such toilets proved valuable not only in eco-friendly homes, but also in remote areas, disaster zones, and developing regions where plumbing infrastructure was limited. The modern era also brought toilets into places once thought impossible. Mountaineering expeditions, for example, had to confront the problem of human waste on peaks like Mount Everest. For years, climbers simply left waste on the slopes, creating unsanitary conditions. Recently, portable waste bags and designated collection barrels were introduced, requiring climbers to carry out what they produced. In Antarctica, international treaties forbid leaving human waste behind. Research stations use incinerating toilets or store sealed waste for removal. Scientists understand that even small amounts of contamination could disrupt delicate ecosystems. In submarines, military bases, and desert encampments, specialized toilets adapt to harsh conditions. Each represents the principle that wherever humans go, toilets must follow. Modernity also brought playful and unusual approaches to toilets. Some restaurants and art exhibits designed toilets shaped like transparent glass cubes that fog over when occupied. Others experimented with toilets themed around humor or pop culture. In South Korea, there is even a toilet museum dedicated to the history and innovation of sanitation. Its displays include golden toilets, whimsical statues, and exhibitions explaining how toilets reflect civilization. Festivals have sprung up too. The World Toilet Summit, organized by the World Toilet Organization, gathers experts to discuss sanitation challenges, from urban slums to futuristic designs. Though the subject is often laughed at, the summit underscores that toilets remain critical for health and dignity. As humanity prepares for longer space missions and possibly settlements beyond Earth, toilets will continue to evolve. Engineers envision closed-loop systems where nothing is wasted, urine and feces processed into water, nutrients, even fuel. On Mars, for example, human waste could be used to fertilize crops or produce methane for energy. Back on Earth, the future may bring toilets that diagnose illness instantly, helping detect conditions like diabetes or infections before symptoms appear. Artificial intelligence might one day analyze waste data across populations to predict epidemics or monitor public health trends. What once seemed an unmentionable necessity is now on the frontier of science and technology. Toilets are no longer just fixtures of daily life. They are tools of survival, comfort, and even exploration. From space capsules to smart homes, toilets have shown that no matter how advanced humanity becomes, our most basic needs still shape our inventions. In orbit, on mountains, in deserts, and in cities, toilets remind us that being human means finding ways to preserve dignity, health, and continuity, even in the most extraordinary circumstances. As we reach the end of this long and winding journey through the history of toilets, it becomes clear that this is more than a story about plumbing or waste disposal. It is, in many ways, a story about us. Our ingenuity, our fears, our priorities, and our cultural identities are all reflected in the toilets we build and use. Far from being trivial, toilets reveal deep truths about human civilization. Toilets, in their many forms, mirror the values and structures of the societies that create them. In ancient cities, public latrines symbolized community and shared responsibility. In castles, private garderobes represented hierarchy, offering rulers seclusion, while commoners endured communal arrangements. In modern homes, the bathroom became a place of privacy and comfort, reflecting the increasing emphasis on individuality. They also reflect wealth and inequality. In prosperous societies, toilets became more sophisticated, often adorned with luxury. Meanwhile, in poorer areas, sanitation remained rudimentary or absent, underscoring divides that still persist today. Access to a clean, safe toilet is not universal, and that disparity is one of the most telling markers of inequality across the globe. Perhaps no invention has saved more lives quietly than the humble toilet. The arrival of sewer systems in industrial cities drastically reduced deaths from cholera, typhoid, and other diseases. It is difficult to overstate the impact. Where people once accepted frequent outbreaks as part of life, modern sanitation turned cities into healthier, safer places. The transformation was not immediate. Many resisted new sewer systems, complaining about costs or distrusting new technologies. Yet once established, the benefits were undeniable. Entire populations lived longer, children survived into adulthood at higher rates, and the very rhythm of urban life shifted. When we think of great achievements in medicine, vaccines, antibiotics, surgical breakthroughs, we rarely think of toilets. Yet toilets and sewers, by breaking the chain of contamination, may have done just as much for human survival as any other innovation. They are a silent guardian of health, one we seldom acknowledge but constantly rely upon. Toilets also reveal how cultures confront taboos. In many places, speaking of bodily functions was once forbidden in polite society. Euphemisms developed: lavatory, restroom, powder room, all ways to avoid saying what the space was really for. Architecture often tucked toilets away in corners, down corridors, or outside entirely, as though to hide them from notice. At the same time, humor around toilets and waste has always existed. Children laugh at jokes about it, and adults often share them in private. This duality, silence in public, amusement in private, shows how humans manage discomfort with subjects both universal and unavoidable. Different cultures also bring different attitudes. In some, water-based cleaning after using the toilet is considered essential. In others, paper suffices. In some societies, squatting remains the norm, while others prefer sitting. None of these methods is inherently superior. They simply reflect varied traditions and beliefs about hygiene. There is also a political dimension. Who controls access to sanitation often holds power. In feudal times, rulers had better facilities than peasants, reinforcing their superiority. In industrial cities, landlords sometimes denied tenants proper toilets, saving money at the expense of health. Even today, access to toilets can be a form of exclusion. In some countries, public restrooms are scarce, making life difficult for women, the elderly, or those with medical needs. For homeless individuals, the lack of public toilets can turn daily life into a struggle for dignity. Debates over where toilets are built, who can use them, and how they are maintained remain deeply tied to issues of justice and rights. Throughout history, toilets have driven innovation. From clay pipes in Mesopotamia to Roman aqueducts, from medieval garderobes to space suction systems, sanitation has pushed engineers and builders to think in new ways. Toilets may not inspire the same awe as cathedrals or palaces, yet they embody the same human drive to solve problems with creativity. In the future, toilets may become even more advanced. Imagine devices that monitor health automatically, conserving resources, and even converting waste into useful products. Toilets could become medical tools as well as sanitation devices, turning something private into a source of collective well-being. One of the most important lessons from this history is that toilets are about dignity. To have a safe, private place to relieve oneself is not a luxury, it is a fundamental human right. When people lack toilets, they often suffer shame, danger, and illness. When communities gain toilets, they gain not just cleanliness, but confidence and self-respect. International organizations now recognize this truth. Campaigns to improve sanitation in developing regions stress not only the health benefits, but also the empowerment it brings, especially for women and children. Toilets allow girls to attend school without fear, families to live without daily hazards, and entire communities to thrive. No matter how different cultures may seem, everyone shares the same basic need. A toilet is a universal human denominator. Kings and peasants, astronauts and nomads, city dwellers and mountaineers all must answer the same call. This shared reality links us across time and space, reminding us that beneath all our differences we are deeply alike. It is remarkable to think that the same act which once defined ancient Roman bathhouses, medieval garderobes, palace privies, and space capsules continues unchanged. The settings differ, the technology evolves, but the need remains constant. In that constancy lies a rare glimpse of what it means to be human. Looking back, several lessons emerge. Necessity drives innovation. The challenges of waste management forced humans to invent systems that reshaped entire cities and enabled exploration beyond Earth. Sanitation underpins survival. Without toilets, disease flourished. With them, health and longevity improved dramatically. Culture shapes design. Every society adapted toilets to its own customs, beliefs and resources, creating endless variety. Dignity matters. Access to toilets reflects respect for human needs. Denial of access diminishes individuals and communities alike. These lessons remind us that toilets, far from being trivial, are essential threads in the fabric of civilization. As we close this exploration, it is worth pausing to appreciate the ordinary act of using a toilet. For most of us, it is so routine that we barely notice it. Yet behind that routine lies thousands of years of trial, error, ingenuity, and persistence. Every flush, every turn of a tap, every door that closes behind us carries with it the legacy of countless civilizations striving for comfort, safety, and dignity. The story of toilets is the story of humanity confronting its most basic reality with creativity and determination. From the first simple pits to advanced systems in orbit, we have refused to accept discomfort as inevitable. Instead, we built, improved, and imagined. In doing so, we not only made our lives cleaner and longer, we revealed something fundamental about ourselves. That, perhaps, is the greatest truth toilets can tell us. They remind us that even in the most unglamorous corners of life, we are capable of extraordinary invention. They show that civilization is not only measured in monuments or battles, but also in the quiet, hidden places where we preserve health and dignity. So the next time you close a bathroom door or hear the sound of a flush, remember, you are participating in one of humanity's most enduring and transformative stories. A story that unites emperors and astronauts, villagers and visionaries. A story as universal as life itself.